Story 1. The Curious Life of Sir Thomas More's Pet Monkey. You may imagine Sir Thomas More, the statesman, writer, and eventual martyr, seated in his study at Chelsea. Around him are his books, his letters, and the quiet murmur of household life. Servants carrying trays, the sound of a quill scratching across parchment, the rustle of pages being turned in Latin or Greek. The house of a prominent Tudor lawyer and advisor to Henry VIII was not only a workplace for intellectual exchange, but also a domestic scene filled with animals, children, and the daily rhythm of survival. Among the chickens scratching in the yard, the dogs at the hearth, and the horses stabled nearby, there was said to be a small, mischievous figure, a pet monkey. It may seem strange to us today, but keeping exotic animals in Renaissance households was not uncommon among the wealthy and curious. Monkeys, parrots, and even more unusual beasts were brought from distant ports as signs of status, fascination, or mere amusement. In More's case, the monkey has slipped into historical record only faintly, like an afterthought in marginalia or anecdote. Yet its presence tells us something about Tudor life: the blending of the ordinary and the peculiar, the reach of trade across seas, and the private eccentricities of one of England's most famous thinkers. Monkeys in the Tudor world. To understand why Sir Thomas More might have had a monkey, you have to consider the networks of commerce and exploration that were expanding during his lifetime. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, England was not the most powerful seafaring nation, not yet, but it was already deeply entangled in European trade. Ships from Spain, Portugal, and Italy brought goods from Africa, Asia, and the Americas into continental markets. From there, many items trickled into English ports. Exotic animals were part of this exchange. Monkeys in particular were admired for their human-like qualities, their dexterous hands, their expressive faces, and their tendency to imitate gestures. They were seen as both comical and uncanny. Wealthy households sometimes kept them as living novelties, much as a rare tapestry or a carved ivory piece might be displayed. Owning one signaled connections to global trade, access to wealth, and a taste for the unusual. But while we can imagine a monkey perched in More's household, we must also imagine the care it required. How was it fed? Who looked after it? Bananas were not the staple food of England. Instead, monkeys might have been given bread, nuts, fruit, or table scraps. Servants likely bore the burden of tending to the animal, cleaning its messes, and enduring its mischief. For while monkeys are delightful to watch, they are notorious for pulling at clothing, stealing objects, and nipping fingers. Thus, in Chelsea, among books and humanist scholars, there might also have been a monkey tugging at quills or attempting to overturn an ink pot. The creature's antics would have amused children and visitors alike, while perhaps frustrating those tasked with keeping the household in order. The household of Sir Thomas More. More's home was not a simple one. As Chancellor of England, his household was large, well-staffed, and orderly, reflecting both his public station and his private values. Humanist visitors from across Europe, Erasmus most famously, remarked on the harmony and learning fostered there. Education was central, with More ensuring that his daughters as well as his sons were tutored in Latin and literature. The presence of a monkey in such a household seems almost out of place, a small element of chaos within a scene of discipline. Yet perhaps that is exactly why it fit. More's world was one of contrasts, piety and wit, solemn duty and playful irony. His writings show a man capable of great seriousness and great humor, and perhaps the monkey embodied that lighter side. Imagine, if you will, the monkey sitting by the hearth while More dictated letters, or chattering when visitors arrived. It was, after all, not just a pet but a conversational piece. Just as the sight of an exotic animal might prompt questions about distant lands, it might also spark discussions of philosophy, of man's relation to nature, of the blurred lines between reason and instinct. For children in the household, the monkey would have been a source of fascination. Margaret More, his brilliant daughter, may have watched it closely, noting how its hands moved, how it expressed anger or delight. Did she see in it a mirror of human behavior, a lesson in observation, much like the lessons her father prized. We cannot know, but we can linger with the image. A Tudor household, candles flickering, Latin texts on the table, and a monkey darting across the floor. The monkey as symbol. Monkeys held symbolic meaning in the Renaissance. In art, they often represented folly, vice, or base instinct. A monkey chained might signify the triumph of reason over animal desire. A free monkey, by contrast, could embody disorder or temptation. To keep a monkey was thus not only a sign of wealth but also a gesture loaded with associations. For More, who delighted in symbols and allegory, perhaps the monkey was more than mere amusement. It might have reminded him and those who visited of the thin line between wisdom and foolishness, between civilization and chaos. His famous book, Utopia, is filled with careful paradoxes and playful inversions. Might the monkey, ever restless and unpredictable, have served as a living emblem of that same paradoxical spirit? Consider, too, that More's eventual fate, executed for refusing to bow to Henry VII's will, is remembered as the triumph of conscience over power. In such a light, the monkey in his household can be seen as a quiet companion in the broader story of human freedom and captivity. Was it caged? Was it free to roam? The answer may say something about how More perceived the boundaries of control in his own life. A day in Chelsea. Let us linger for a moment on a single imagined day in More's Chelsea home. The morning begins early, with servants stoking fires and preparing bread. The Thames flows nearby, carrying boats to and from the city. More sits in his study, dictating a letter. Outside, children laugh in the garden, their voices carrying through open shutters. Somewhere in the midst of this, the monkey scampers across the floor, dragging a piece of cloth it has stolen from the laundry. A servant hurries after it, scolding. The detail is mundane, even dull, yet it anchors us in the reality of Tudor life, a world not only of kings and politics but also of daily frustrations, petty amusements, and unexpected companions. We often imagine history in terms of grand events, but it was also composed of such small moments of animals kept for reasons half practical, half whimsical, of children learning amidst distraction, of households where the ordinary and the peculiar coexisted. Trade and transportation. The presence of the monkey reminds us of another layer, the immense networks of trade that brought such creatures to English shores. Ships from West Africa or the Canary Islands might have carried monkeys in cages, along with spices, textiles, and other commodities. The animals endured long voyages, often poorly fed, many perishing before arrival. Those that survived became commodities in themselves, sold to merchants or courtiers. To own a monkey was thus not simply a matter of taste, but of access. More's household, situated within the circles of power, had that access. The animal was a token of England's growing entanglement with distant lands, a small but living reminder that the world was larger than the fields of Chelsea or the halls of Westminster. And yet, once in the household, the monkey's world shrank. No longer swinging through trees, it was confined to human spaces, adapting to bread crusts and candlelight. Its fate was tied to the rhythms of Tudor domesticity, its antics both tolerated and curtailed. The quiet place of animals in history. What strikes us most, perhaps, is how easily such details are forgotten. History tends to record kings, treaties, and battles, but the presence of a monkey in a statesman's home slips through the cracks. It is mentioned here or there, almost casually, as though it mattered little. Yet for the household itself, it must have mattered a great deal. The training, the feeding, the frustrations, the laughter. Animals have always been part of human history, not only as laborers or food, but as companions and symbols. More's monkey belongs to that hidden history, the quiet story of how humans shaped their daily worlds, how they filled them with both necessity and novelty. By pausing on such a figure, we glimpse the texture of the past, not just its grand narratives but its overlooked threads. So in the household of Sir Thomas More, alongside scholars and servants, children and books, there lived a monkey. Its presence spoke of global trade, of curiosity, of human folly and amusement. It tugged at the edges of discipline, it mirrored human gestures, it served as both companion and reminder of the strangeness of life in Tudor England. And yet we are left to wonder, what became of this monkey? Was it treasured until the end, or did it fade into obscurity, forgotten by all but a few? Did it survive More's fall from royal favor, or was it lost before that turning point? That question, unresolved, leads us onward. The monkey moves closer to power. It is tempting to imagine that the monkey stayed tucked away at More's estate in Chelsea, far from the storms of Tudor politics. But this was not a static household. Thomas More's rise in court brought with it a rotation of visitors, letters, responsibilities, and eventually, a closer physical and political proximity to the king himself. From 1516 onward, More's career advanced steadily. His work as an ambassador, legal scholar, and privy councillor brought him into the orbit of Henry VIII more frequently. In 1529, he became Lord Chancellor, the highest office under the crown, one that placed him at the heart of statecraft and court. So what became of the household during these transitions? The monkey may have traveled with the family between Chelsea and London, or remained a fixture in the quieter domestic scenes while More attended to affairs of state. Either way, it continued to occupy a place not only in More's home, but symbolically in his world, a small creature from afar, living amid the swell of history's tide. Monkeys at court, a broader context. To better understand the life of More's monkey, it helps to consider the broader landscape of animal ownership among Tudor elites. Henry VIII himself kept a menagerie of exotic animals. His palace at Greenwich and the Tower of London both housed collections of beasts acquired through foreign gifts or trade. These included lions, leopards, and monkeys, creatures that, while unsuited to England's climate, were kept as signs of magnificence. They were not pets in the modern sense, but spectacles. Smaller monkeys, such as Barbary macaques or capuchins, were more commonly kept by courtiers. They were small enough to be managed indoors, mischievous enough to amuse guests, and clever enough to be trained to perform tricks or mimic actions. Accounts from the period mention monkeys wearing miniature clothing, being taught to salute or bow, and even being placed in mock duels for entertainment. While this might sound cruel today, it was, in its time, both fashionable and symbolic. A monkey behaving like a human reminded observers of the fragility of human reason and of the thin line between mastery and mimicry. Domestic disruption. But the novelty of a monkey came at a price. Even in well-run households, the animal was a source of chaos. Inventories and letters from the period occasionally record broken goblets, torn linens, or stolen trinkets, all attributed to the monkey's antics. In More's Chelsea household, where discipline and learning were highly valued, such interruptions might have been seen both as tests of patience and as opportunities for humor. It is not hard to imagine a servant chasing the monkey through the study, or the animal climbing onto a dinner table during a conversation about Play-Doh. These moments, unrecorded yet probable, speak to the contrast between the idealized image of the Renaissance household and the actual day-to-day realities of domestic life. Even the most orderly homes had elements of unpredictability: monkeys, children, servants, sickness, weather. For More, a man committed to both philosophical inquiry and moral order, the monkey may have offered a living metaphor. The unpredictability of life, the challenge of control, and the humility of being reminded daily that not everything could be planned. Servants and the monkey's care. While it is tempting to focus on More's relationship with the animal, the daily care of the monkey would have fallen to the household's servants, an invisible labor force that supported the dignity of elite life. Feeding the monkey, cleaning up after it, keeping it warm during winter months, protecting it from dogs or curious children, all these tasks required time and effort. The monkey might have been affectionate one day, hostile the next. A bite, a scratch, a stolen object, these were not rare occurrences. And so the monkey, while amusing to guests, was likely a source of frustration for those charged with managing the smooth flow of the household. It interrupted routines, disrupted meals, and perhaps even damaged costly items. Yet it was retained, perhaps beloved, and certainly tolerated. This tolerance says something about the values of the time, a willingness to accept a certain amount of disorder in the name of novelty, social standing, or personal affection. The monkey's presence was not rationally useful, but it added texture to the home. The Monkey and More's intellectual circle. Sir Thomas More's Chelsea household was a destination for some of the most prominent intellectuals of his age. Chief among them was Desiderius Erasmus, the Dutch humanist, who had a long-standing friendship with More. Erasmus visited Chelsea multiple times and praised More's hospitality, his children's learning, and the peaceful atmosphere of the home. Though Erasmus does not mention the monkey directly in surviving letters, the animal may well have been present during these visits. What would Erasmus, author of In Praise of Folly, have made of it? Perhaps he would have drawn a connection between the monkey's behavior and his own critiques of human pretension. Monkeys, after all, were the ultimate mimics, performing actions without understanding, a fitting mirror for many of the clerics and courtiers Erasmus lampooned. We can imagine the two men, sitting near a fire, discussing theology or classical texts, while the monkey, unconcerned with the dignity of the occasion, rummaged through a satchel or leapt onto a bench. Such a scene reminds us that great ideas are not always born in silence or solemnity. They emerge in the midst of life with all its noise, smells, and interruptions. The monkey, far from being a distraction, may have embodied this reality. Utopia, monkeys, and the role of satire. In 1516, More published Utopia, a satirical work describing an ideal society on a fictional island. The book presents a blend of radical social proposals and subtle mockery of European norms, a duality that mirrored More's own mind. Though the monkey is not mentioned in Utopia, its symbolic presence lingers in the text's themes. The book repeatedly raises questions about human nature, imitation, and the gap between appearance and reality. Monkeys, being skilled imitators, occupy a special place in that symbolic landscape. They look human but are not. They act with apparent purpose but without understanding. To keep a monkey in one's home was, in a sense, to live with a daily reminder of this gap, a small, furry paradox sitting atop the mantel. Perhaps More, in writing Utopia, glanced occasionally at the monkey, noting its gestures, its mimicry, and its lack of restraint. Perhaps he saw in it the very absurdities he wished to highlight in his political satire. The family's response. More's children were exceptionally well educated, with Margaret Roper standing out for her intellect and devotion. She and her siblings were trained in Latin, logic, and classical literature, rare for women of the time. What did they think of the monkey? Did they name it, try to train it, include it in their letters or drawings? Unfortunately, we have no written record of their interactions with the animal, but given their curiosity and proximity, it is reasonable to believe the monkey was part of their childhood experience. It may have sat beside them during lessons, interrupted reading sessions, or accompanied them during walks in the garden. To grow up in such a household surrounded by books, debates, and a mischievous monkey must have shaped their sense of the world. It taught, perhaps unconsciously, that learning was not separate from life but embedded within it. As the tide turns. By the early 1530s, More's position at court had become increasingly precarious. Henry VII's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and the subsequent break with the Catholic Church, placed More in an impossible position. In 1532, he resigned as Lord Chancellor. 2 years later, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London for refusing to acknowledge the king as head of the Church of England. In 1535, he was executed. During these years of rising tension, what became of the monkey? Was it still at Chelsea, offering a flicker of familiarity during moments of crisis? Or was it already gone, a memory from a calmer time? The historical record does not say, but perhaps that very absence is part of the point. The limits of what we know. History, for all its grandeur, is often full of silences. We know of wars and treaties, of marriages and deaths, but we know very little about the monkey that lived in More's household. Its breed is unknown. Its name is lost. Its ultimate fate, whether it died young, was given away, or outlived More himself, remains undocumented. And yet, for all this, the monkey lives on in the margins of history, reminding us that the past was not merely a collection of solemn events. It was full of noise, chaos, furor, and laughter, and of lives that left no trace but shadows. As More's world narrowed from court to household to prison cell, we are left with the image of a monkey once part of his daily life vanishing from view. But was the monkey forgotten or merely overlooked? In the end, most stories do not conclude with clarity. The people and creatures who once stirred in the soft corners of history vanish into its fog, not with drama, but with quiet erasure. The story of Sir Thomas More's pet monkey is one such example. After years of scattered glimpses, small, playful shadows amid politics and philosophy, it disappears. And yet, in this absence, the monkey leaves behind something vital, a trace of the human condition, a thread that connects the grandeur of Tudor politics with the unnoticed lives that shared their space. The monkey becomes a symbol not just of mimicry or mischief, but of how even the smallest beings move through and are shaped by the tides of empire, learning, and loss. Let us consider for a while longer what this monkey left behind, not in record but in presence, not in legacy but in context. The pet that history forgot. The very act of looking for the monkey in the historical record reveals the gaps and biases of history itself. We have ample documentation of Thomas More's moral philosophy, his letters to Erasmus, his treatises, and even his execution. We have inventories of his estate, descriptions of his house, and memorials to his conscience. But the monkey, at best, it appears in a handful of anecdotes, passing references in correspondence or domestic memoirs written generations later. There is no formal record of its arrival, no notation in estate books detailing its cost or care. It is as though it simply appeared and then, in time, evaporated. This is typical of how history treats the marginal. Even animals that lived in close proximity to great men and women rarely leave behind more than a word or two. Horses ridden into battle are sometimes named. Hunting dogs occasionally receive a line of praise in letters. But a monkey, a disruptive, playful, decorative creature, is forgotten almost entirely. And yet it was there, we are sure of this much. It lived. It moved through the same rooms where More translated Plato and discussed papal authority. It shared a household that would eventually be memorialized as the dwelling of a martyr and saint. And that, perhaps, is enough to pause. What animals witness? Consider this. The monkey may have been present during some of More's most decisive moments. In the months and years leading to his resignation as Lord Chancellor, More grew increasingly silent in public. He avoided commenting on the king's annulment or the Act of Supremacy. But in private, he surely spoke more freely. Around the hearth at Chelsea, conversations must have grown darker, tenser. Did the monkey listen? Did it sit on a windowsill as voices rose? Did it scurry across the floor when More sighed in frustration, or pace the study while papers were burned or hidden? Of course, animals do not understand politics and monkeys do not track the Reformation. But animals are present. They witness. They feel the tone of a room shift. They respond to the vibrations of fear, sorrow, or joy. They exist not outside of human history, but beside it, silently cataloging its emotional register. Perhaps the monkey noticed when More's friends stopped visiting. or when laughter became rarer in the evenings, or when doors were locked more tightly than before. It would not have known why, but it would have known something had changed. Departure and decline. At some point, the monkey must have been parted from its home. It may have died of cold one winter. These exotic animals, rarely long-lived in northern climates, often succumb to illness or injury. Or it may have been given away a gift to a friend, a burden handed off to another household, or a diplomatic offering. Monkeys were traded as status symbols as casually as books or gloves. Alternatively, perhaps the monkey lived into old age, becoming slower, quieter, and increasingly less troublesome and thus less visible. There is also the possibility, however remote, that the monkey outlived More, that it continued to reside at Chelsea after More's arrest in 1534, that it waited, perhaps instinctively, for its companion to return. We know that Margaret Roper retrieved her father's head after his execution and buried it with reverence. Her devotion to him was total. Would she have tended to his monkey as well? We can only speculate, but in that speculation lies a quiet reverence for the unseen stories that must have existed, even if they left no trace. The monkey as mirror. More's monkey, in its forgotten life, remains strangely appropriate to his philosophy. Thomas More wrote frequently about the illusions of control, the vanity of titles, and the fallibility of human reason. In Utopia, he sketched a society organized around common ownership and rational design, but beneath the surface of this satire lies deep ambiguity. Is it truly a model for perfection, or a critique of human pretension? The monkey, always imitating but never quite understanding, mirrored this theme. It could mimic human gestures, raising a spoon, turning a page, but it could not grasp meaning. It existed in that uncanny space between reflection and distortion. Perhaps More, who saw through the pageantry of Tudor politics and died for his principles, understood the monkey as a reminder of human fallibility. We think ourselves wise, but often act out of instinct. We believe we reason, but we frequently imitate. In this light, the monkey is not a distraction from More's story, but a deep part of it, a living allegory moving through the margins of his household. A monastic quiet. After More's death, his house at Chelsea passed into other hands. The rhythm of life continued. Fires were lit, children born, meals served. The river still flowed outside the windows, carrying barges up and down the Thames. And yet something was lost. In losing More, England lost one of its most complex minds, a man who served the state and then defied it. In losing his household, we lost the rich domestic world that surrounded that mind. The books, the voices, the laughter, the meals, and yes, the monkey. We often think of history as loud, filled with speeches, declarations, swords clashing, but most of it is quiet. It happens in kitchens, courtyards, bedrooms, and back gardens. It happens in the brushing of fur, the washing of feet, the setting of tables. The monkey lived in that quiet, and perhaps that is why it slips from our grasp now. A final glimpse. Let us imagine one last time a day in Chelsea. The weather is overcast. The candles have just been lit. More is seated in his study, writing a letter to a friend in Bruges. A fire crackles gently nearby. In the corner of the room, the monkey sleeps curled in a blanket, its tail flicking once as it dreams. A child passes by, careful not to wake it. A servant closes the door quietly. Outside, the city is changing. Reformation stirs, power shifts, but in this room there is stillness. The mind of a philosopher bends over a page. A creature from another continent sleeps by his side. It is just another day, but it is also somehow the world. Closing reflection. We will never know the full story of Sir Thomas More's pet monkey, but in piecing together what little we can, we find a window not only into one household, but into an entire world, a world of trade, intellect, devotion, mimicry, and silence. And perhaps that is what history is, at its best, an effort to notice what we are usually too distracted to see. The monkey was not great nor powerful. It did not write books or hold office. It did not fight in war or shape theology, but it lived, and for a time it mattered. And now, as you drift gently toward sleep, you might wonder, how many other creatures have shaped history from the edges, only to be forgotten? Story 2. The history of medieval beds from straw to feathers. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we tend to think of castles and battles, illuminated manuscripts and plague carts. But for every knight or monk, there were thousands of ordinary people, farmers, merchants, shepherds who spent a third of their lives asleep, or at least trying to. Sleep is one of the most universal human experiences, yet it is also one of the least discussed in the pages of history. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the long, humble, and often uncomfortable history of the medieval bed. This story begins, not in palaces or courts, but in the uneven cottages of the common folk, places where the floor was earthen, the windows small, and privacy nearly non-existent. It begins with straw stuffed in sacks and ends slowly, over centuries, with feathers fluffed beneath linen sheets. So lay back, close your eyes, and imagine sleeping in a world where the mattress was often your only insulation from the cold, where night was lit by candle or not at all, and where even the act of lying down was governed by the season, the harvest, and the class into which you were born. Before the bed frame, sleeping on the ground. In early medieval Europe, from roughly the 5th to the 10th centuries, beds were not yet beds in the way we know them. For most people, a bed was simply a designated place to sleep, and that place was usually the floor. In poorer rural homes, there were no wooden bed frames, no plush cushions, no separation from the chill that crept through dirt floors. A family might spread a layer of straw, reeds, or heather directly on the ground, topping it with a coarse blanket or animal hide. These improvised pallets were called straw ticks, and they were not designed for comfort. They were designed to be marginally better than sleeping directly on the cold, hard earth. The straw had to be replaced regularly, lest it rot or attract fleas. Sometimes aromatic herbs like lavender or tansy were mixed in, not for luxury but to deter insects. The tick was refilled as needed, stuffed by hand, stitched shut, slept on, and eventually burned or composted. There was little romanticism in it. For the average medieval peasant, sleep was functional, a break between chores, a place to rest tired muscles before rising at dawn to do it all again. Shared beds, shared lives. In a one-room cottage, there was no such thing as a private bed. Entire families often slept together, huddled for warmth. Parents, children, sometimes even animals would share a single sleeping space. This wasn't a matter of affection, though certainly there was warmth and intimacy. It was necessity. The body heat of multiple sleepers made a crucial difference on long winter nights. Livestock were sometimes kept indoors too, their bodies raising the temperature of the dwelling by a few vital degrees. Sleep was communal. There was no bedroom. There was simply a bed if you were lucky, or a straw pile in the corner if you were not. For travelers or servants, sleep might come in even more meager settings: barn lofts, kitchen floors, or benches near the hearth. Some inns offered little more than shared hay with strangers. Personal space, as we understand it today, was a luxury unknown to most. Seasonal beds, hay in summer, wool in winter. The materials of medieval bedding changed with the seasons and the region. In temperate zones, hay was favored in the warmer months for its availability and dryness. In colder regions, wool or even moss was used to add warmth and weight. The idea of owning different bedding for different seasons was rare, except among the wealthy. For most, the bedding was adjusted out of sheer necessity. A too light straw mattress in winter could be deadly. Conversely, a dense wool tick in summer could make sleeping unbearably hot. Thus, medieval households, especially rural ones, had to think practically. Bedding was another tool of survival, to be managed like food stores or firewood. Some people slept in their clothes, others wrapped themselves in their cloaks. Linen sheets were almost non-existent in the peasant home. If they were used, they were often reserved for childbirth or sickness times when the body was at particular risk. Beds for the wealthy, from platforms to canopies. While the commoners slept on the floor, the wealthy had beds of a very different kind, though even these were a far cry from modern standards. In manor houses and castles, wooden platforms were used to raise beds off the ground. This was partly for comfort, but also for hygiene. Distance from the floor meant less exposure to cold drafts, vermin, and damp. On these platforms were laid bed frames, wooden structures that supported a mattress stuffed with wool, feathers, or sometimes down. The mattress would be set atop ropes or leather straps stretched across the frame. These supports needed to be tightened regularly, hence the phrase, "sleep tight." Featherbeds were rare and valuable. They were often passed down as heirlooms, mentioned in wills alongside silverware or land. A featherbed could take years to fill, as geese were plucked only during molting season. It was not uncommon for a single bed to be the result of generations of feather collecting. Atop the mattress there might be linen sheets, a wool blanket, and in the coldest climates a fur coverlet. Around the bed, heavy curtains could be drawn for warmth and privacy. These tester beds, with their 4 posts and canopies, were the predecessors of modern 4-poster beds. And yet for all this grandeur, even noble beds were not entirely comfortable. Lice were common, mattresses sagged, feathers clumped, cleaning was difficult, and as with all bedding, maintenance was constant. Rituals of sleep. Contrary to modern assumptions, medieval people did not sleep in a single uninterrupted stretch. Studies of sleep patterns, both historical and anthropological, suggest that people in pre-industrial societies often slept in 2 distinct phases: first sleep and second sleep. They would go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for several hours, then awaken in the middle of the night, not fully, but enough to tend to the fire, pray, or even socialize briefly, and then return to sleep until dawn. This segmented sleep was likely shaped by the rhythms of natural light and the absence of artificial illumination. In this context, beds were not just places for unconscious rest, but also for reflection, murmured conversation, or quiet prayer in the hours before sunrise. Such rhythms meant that the bed, however humble, played a central role in shaping how people moved through time. Crafting a mattress, labor and time. Making a bed in the Middle Ages was no simple task. Straw ticks had to be cut, dried, stuffed, sewn, and stored. Featherbeds, as mentioned, were slow labors of patience. Even assembling the frame required woodworking skill. In towns and cities, specialized tradespeople known as upholders, the precursors to upholsterers, sold ready-made bedding or repaired old mattresses. In wealthier homes, servants were assigned to shake out and air the bedding daily, reducing mold and infestation. For the poor, the labor was personal. Each year the bedding had to be remade. Straw was burned and replaced. Feathers had to be refluffed and dried. If a mattress tore, it was mended with twine. If it sagged, the stuffing was rearranged. A good bed, even a straw bed, was a thing of value. And like all valuable things in the medieval world, it required attention. Beds in literature and religion. Beds appear frequently in medieval literature and religious writing, not only as settings for intimacy or illness, but as symbols of morality. A neat bed signified virtue. A disordered bed could suggest sin. Saints were said to sleep on boards or straw to prove their humility. Nobles, by contrast, were criticized for decadent beds that encouraged laziness or lust. In the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer describes beds both grand and simple, drawing contrasts between clerics and tradesmen, knights and wives. Beds were not just furniture, they were moral landscapes. And in religious texts, sleep was often used as a metaphor for spiritual vulnerability. The bed became a place where demons tempted the soul, where dreams offered divine messages, or where death quietly arrived. To sleep in the Middle Ages was not simply to rest, it was to enter a liminal space between body and spirit. As you drift into your own soft bed tonight, it may be worth considering the countless others who have laid down before you on straw, on wool, beside animals or family, beneath heavy blankets or thin linen sheets. They too watched candlelight flicker on the wall. They too pulled blankets close against the chill. They too closed their eyes and waited for the long silence of night. But did they sleep soundly? Or did the crackle of the hearth and the rustle of straw keep them wondering, what truly makes a good night's rest? If the mattress was the base of medieval sleep, then the pillow was its most uncertain luxury. While today the pillow is nearly universal given on any bed, in any home in the Middle Ages, it was a sign of class, gender, and, oddly enough, moral concern. To lay one's head on a soft cushion was not just a matter of comfort, but an act that might imply wealth, indulgence, or even spiritual danger. And that is where our story picks up, not in the grand halls of nobility, but again among the quieter truths of daily life. This is a story of what lay beneath your head, what crawled beneath the sheets, and what it meant to truly sleep alone. Pillows for the weak and the wealthy. In early medieval England, pillows were not for everyone. In fact, for many, they were seen as unnecessary, even suspicious. Ecclesiastical writings sometimes associated pillows with softness of character. Monks and nuns were discouraged from using them. Pillows represented bodily indulgence, a departure from spiritual rigor. Saint Cuthbert, for instance, was said to rest his head only on a stone. In peasant homes, pillows were virtually unknown. If anything was used to elevate the head, it was a folded cloak, a bundle of clothes, or a sack of straw. Some people used their own arms. Others slept flat, with no elevation at all. Among the elite, however, pillows began to take on decorative and social significance. Embroidered pillows became part of the household inventory, not merely tools for sleep, but objects to be displayed, inherited, or gifted. Some were stuffed with feathers or wool, others with straw or horsehair. They were covered in linen or silk, depending on the household's wealth. Women of status often embroidered pillows as part of their dowries. The more elaborately stitched the pillow, the greater the domestic skill implied. In this way, pillows were not only for the head, they were part of the language of love, marriage, and propriety. But it wasn't until the late medieval period, around the 14th and 15th centuries, that pillows began to appear more commonly in urban households. And even then, they remained a mark of distinction, rather than a universal item. Sheets, blankets, and bedding hierarchies. If pillows were rare, linen sheets were rarer still. Most peasants slept directly on their tick or between coarse blankets. Linen was expensive, it had to be spun, woven, and bleached, and it required careful washing. A linen sheet might be owned by a family, but not necessarily used every night. It was brought out for special occasions, childbirth, or illness. Blankets were usually wool, often rough and heavy. They were not brightly dyed or trimmed. A good woolen blanket was dark, practical, and warm, and possibly never washed. The smell of such bedding was part of the household atmosphere. In some homes, blankets were passed between family members as needed. A single blanket might serve different sleepers on different nights. Among the nobility, however, bedding became layered and lavish. A noble bed might feature a bottom sheet, linen; a top sheet, linen; one or more blankets, wool or fur lined; a counterpane or quilt; decorative cushions or bolsters; and above it all, the bed curtains, thick, embroidered, often velvet or brocade, drawn closed at night for warmth and privacy. These beds were not simply for sleep. They were spaces of ceremony. Births, deaths, intimate conversations, and even official audiences sometimes took place in bedchambers. In royal courts, it was common for monarchs to receive visitors while reclining fully dressed upon their beds, surrounded by richly embroidered textiles and cushions. The bed was, in many ways, the throne of the private realm. Bedfellows who shared your sleep. The modern expectation of a private bed, one adult per mattress, in one enclosed room is a fairly recent invention. For most of medieval history, sleeping was a shared experience. Spouses, children, siblings, servants, and sometimes strangers might all share the same bed. Travelers routinely bunked together in inns. Apprentices slept near their masters. Monks slept in shared dormitories called dormitoria, often on narrow planks or straw-filled mats. There was no social awkwardness in this. The bed was simply the warmest, softest place available. To share it was not necessarily intimate, it was practical. The concept of bed sharing even carried a legal dimension. In some parts of Europe, sharing a bed was considered sufficient evidence of a marital relationship. To bed with someone was a literal and metaphorical turn of phrase. And of course, privacy was limited. Curtains offered some visual separation in noble homes, but in peasant cottages, the sleeping space was entirely public. Children observed their parents. Servants overheard conversations. A bed was never only yours. It wasn't until the 17th century, with the rise of corridors and separate bedrooms, that private sleep began to emerge as a social expectation. Sleep and cleanliness, a daily battle. If sleep was vital, it was also vulnerable, especially to parasites. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were common companions. They lived in the straw, in the wool, in the seams of blankets and ticks. No matter how frequently a bed was aired or refilled, infestation was nearly inevitable. To combat this, medieval households developed several strategies. Bedding was regularly taken outside and beaten with sticks. Mattresses were sun-dried and smoked over fires. Herbs like lavender, rue, wormwood, and pennyroyal were mixed into the stuffing to repel insects. Linen sheets, when available, were washed in caustic lye to kill vermin. In noble households, specialized servants were assigned to manage bedding and detect signs of infestation. Despite these efforts, the nighttime experience often involved scratching, tossing, and coping. A good night's sleep was as much about tolerance as it was about comfort. Parasites were simply part of life, not an exception, but a routine discomfort. Beds and gender. Beds also reflected gender roles in subtle ways. In wealthier households, a wife might manage the household linens and bedding inventory. Her skill in organizing, mending, and presenting beds was part of her domestic reputation. Marriage contracts sometimes included bedding in the dowry sheets, pillows, or even a feather bed. In female convents, beds were symbols of self-denial. Nuns often slept without mattresses or pillows, reinforcing their vows of poverty and humility. Likewise, some male monastics chose to sleep on bare boards or in their clothes, rejecting the comforts of flesh. Conversely, in aristocratic marriages, the shared bed was a space of union, both literal and symbolic. Bedding was part of the wedding gift. To join the bed was a euphemism for consummation. And in widowhood, the empty bed took on new meanings: solitude, memory, or social vulnerability. Thus, across society, the bed was not just a tool for rest, but a stage upon which gender roles were reinforced or subverted. Dreams and superstition. Where one slept was only part of the experience. What happened during sleep, the dreams, the visitations, the visions, held deep significance. Dreams were often seen as messages, divine, demonic, or prophetic. The bed, then, was a liminal space where the soul could drift beyond the body and glimpse truths hidden in waking life. People prayed before bed not only for protection from illness, but from nightmares and nocturnal temptation. There were prayers specifically for safe sleep, and charms sewn into pillows to ward off evil spirits. In some traditions, bobbies were laid on beds of consecrated herbs to guard against witches or fairies. Adults might avoid sleeping on their left side, believing it invited restless dreams. The bed, far from neutral, was a spiritual battleground, a space to be guarded with care. The making of a bedchamber. By the 14th and 15th centuries, wealthier homes began developing distinct bedchambers. These were not simply places to sleep, but semi-private areas that combined sleeping, dressing, and light work. In castles and manor houses, the bedchamber was often attached to the solar a private upper room with windows and hearth. The bed became the centerpiece, raised on a dais, curtained, and surrounded by chests for linens and wardrobes for clothing. Visitors were sometimes invited into the bedchamber for conversation or hospitality, but only the most trusted entered while the bed was in use. Thus, the bedchamber straddled public and private, open in day, intimate by night. The presence of a lockable door, a window with shutters, or a portable basin for washing all reflected a growing awareness of personal space. Slowly, the medieval bedchamber became the early modern bedroom, a place of withdrawal, not just rest. Tonight you may lay your head on a clean pillow, under sheets washed by machine in a room of your own. But once for centuries the act of sleep was shared, scratched, segmented, and spiritual. The medieval bed was not merely furniture. It was a crucible of labor, intimacy, faith, and survival. And yet across all its forms, straw tick, featherbed lininged, louse ridden, it asked the same question we ask now, silently every night. How shall I rest? In the dimly lit corners of medieval homes, the bed was more than a place for nightly rest. It was a centerpiece of life and, more often than not, of death. Births happened in beds, illness lingered in beds, final confessions were whispered into bedclothes. In the end, the bed was where most people spent their last conscious moments. For medieval Europeans, to lie down was as much about preparing for eternity as it was about recovering from a long day. We now turn to the final transformation of the medieval bed, not as a thing of rest, or romance, or daily discomfort, but as the quiet stage for departure from the world. The deathbed as a sacred site. Unlike today, where death often happens in hospitals or hospices, the medieval dying process took place almost exclusively in the home and nearly always in bed. A person nearing death was typically laid out with great care. The bed was tidied, the linens freshened if available, and family members or clergy summoned. Confession and last rites were expected. For those of means, this was a choreographed moment, a spiritual and social act as much as a physical one. The dying person might be propped up with bolsters or feather cushions to help them breathe more easily. Candles were lit. Prayers were spoken. If the dying person could still speak, they would give instructions about their will, land, debts, or dowry. Sometimes they distributed coins, even in those final hours, symbolic acts of charity meant to smooth their passage into the next life. Thus, the bed became a temporary altar, a point of crossing between this world and the next. The phrase deathbed confession came not from poetry, but from daily practice. Bedding the body after death. Once death had occurred, the bed became the place of transition for the body. It might remain there for several hours or even days, depending on custom, weather, and location. The body was washed, wrapped in linen or wool, and laid out for viewing or prayer. Poorer families reused bedding during and after death. A blanket that had covered the living body might then be used to cover the corpse. Shrouds were rarely new. They were passed down, shared, or fashioned from older garments. In wealthier households, a person's deathbed might be distinct, set apart from daily sleeping furniture. Some wills even specified the bequeathal of one's bed and bedding to heirs, with phrases such as, "To my daughter, I leave the feather bed whereon I die." In this way, beds acquired layered meaning. They were not merely for sleep, they were for legacy. The bed in wills and inheritance. One of the most consistent places we find beds recorded in historical documents is in wills. From the 14th century onward, beds and bedding were among the most valuable items in a household, especially in urban centers. Feather beds, bolsters, coverlets, and pillows were all carefully itemized. The quality of bed textiles could define one's class more clearly than almost any other possession. A single entry might read, Item, 1 feather bed with 2 pillows of down, 1 blue coverlet of woolen, and 1 pair of sheets marked with red cross. It was not uncommon for multiple family members to vie for a particular bed, especially if it had sentimental or practical value. A well-made bed could serve a family for generations. Indeed, one could measure a family's fortunes by its bedding inventory. For peasants, the straw tick and wool blanket might not be named in a will, but they were no less meaningful. The act of handing down bedding was part of the broader transmission of memory and survival. Sleeping alone at last. Ironically, in death, many who had slept among others their entire lives finally found themselves alone in bed. Throughout the medieval period, bed sharing was the norm. Privacy was minimal. Yet in old age or terminal illness, a person might be granted solitude not for comfort, but for propriety. The dying needed space for prayers. The body, once dead, needed space to cool and be readied for burial. And so the bed, that crowded, shared space of childhood and adulthood, became solitary at the end. It is perhaps one of the few times a person in the medieval world could claim a bed entirely for themselves. Changing materials, changing meanings. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the materials and meaning of beds were shifting. Trade brought new fabrics, cotton from the Mediterranean, finer linens from Flanders, dyes from the East. Beds became not only softer but more colorful. Red coverlets, green bolsters, blue embroidered pillows, these items began to appear in middle-class households. Beds also grew larger. The introduction of wider bed frames allowed for more comfortable shared sleeping. Rope-sprung mattresses became more common. The phrase, "tighten the bed," referred to the need to periodically resecure the ropes that held the mattress or risk sagging sleep. Even the symbolic meaning of the bed began to evolve. It was no longer just a tool of daily necessity or a station of death. It became a space of privacy, of retreat, of ownership. A place to close a door, draw a curtain, and be alone with thought. The medieval bed was transforming slowly into the modern bed. Beds as markers of social change. The evolution of the bed tells us much about medieval society. As cities grew and trade expanded, the home became a site of individuality. The private bed, once unknown outside monastic or noble spaces, became part of the rising bourgeois experience. In wills from the 1500s, we begin to see more widespread distribution of bedding among non-nobles, town merchants, craftsmen, even senior servants. Ownership of a feather bed signaled arrival into a different social tier. In art, too, beds appeared more often not just in nativity scenes or deathbed portraits, but in images of ordinary domestic life. Paintings showed women nursing infants in curtained beds, scholars reading by candlelight beside a disordered coverlet, and couples embracing under embroidered quilts. The bed had entered the visual and emotional vocabulary of the time. It was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a symbol of stability. The sleeping world behind closed curtains. Let us return once more to a quiet medieval room. The fire has gone out. The wind rustles outside. Someone, a mother, a servant, a child, settles into a straw mattress in the corner. Above them the bed frame groans. Ropes creak. A curtain is drawn shut. Sleep comes slowly. The bed is lumpy, the blanket scratchy, but still the body softens. Breath deepens, the world fades. Somewhere nearby, another person stirs. A baby fusses. A dog shifts on the floor. The house is dark, but it is not silent. There is always movement in the night. In these simple beds shared, Mendied blessed Europe dreamed. It dreamed of saints and sinners, harvests and wars, plagues and lovers. And eventually, it dreamed of a softer world where sleep might come easier and beds might be made just for one. Closing reflection. From rough straw on earthen floors to embroidered linens behind heavy curtains, the medieval bed was more than a tool for sleep, it was a vessel for life itself. It witnessed birth, illness, passion, prayer, and the final exhale. And now, centuries later, as you lie in your own bed, likely warmed by insulation and undisturbed by fleas, you rest on the long, uneven layers of history. For the bed beneath you is not just furniture, it is inheritance. And as your eyes grow heavy, you might ask, what will the beds of the future say about us? Story 3. How a single spoon changed dining in Tudor England. In the grand halls of Tudor banquets and the smoky hearths of village homes, food was shared, chewed, and swallowed with a certain eagerness. But not at first with utensils. For most of medieval and early Tudor history, eating was largely a tactile affair, food brought directly from platter to mouth with fingers, knives, or shared bread. The spoon, however small, curved, and deceptively humble, emerged as a quiet agent of transformation. By the reign of Henry VIII, this curved instrument was no longer just for broth. It had become a symbol of civility, class, and change. The story of the spoon is, in many ways, the story of England's transition from medieval habits to early modern manners. It is about the slow domestication of the table, the shaping of etiquette, and the profound effect a simple utensil had on how people sat, served, and signaled who they were. Eating with fingers and knives. Before the widespread use of spoons and forks, meals in England were deeply communal and deeply manual. Tables were shared, food was served on large trenchers often made of stale bread or wood, and diners used their fingers, sometimes with the assistance of a personal knife, to bring food to their mouths. Knives were essential tools used not only to cut, but also to spear, scoop, and deliver food. A well-bred person was expected to carry their own knife. Hosts did not provide them. A guest without a knife was either very poor or very unprepared. Bread served as a kind of edible utensil, used to sop up juices or cradle meat. Even soups or stews might be partially drained with bread before being lifted to the mouth. Spoons did exist in the early Middle Ages, often carved from wood or horn, but they were rarely personal items. Instead, they were used for serving or slurping pottage, a common peasant dish made of boiled grains, legumes, or vegetables. Outside of this context, most food was eaten by hand. Hygiene by modern standards was secondary. Hands were wiped on cloths or on bread, occasionally dipped in water between courses. Manners were not absent, but they were different. One was expected to keep fingers clean, avoid double dipping, and chew with a closed mouth. But the absence of utensils shaped the entire eating experience. The spoon enters the private home. By the early 16th century, however, spoons began to shift from occasional tools to personal possessions. Silver spoons especially became valuable household items. They were engraved, gifted, and inherited. A child's christening spoon, often made of silver, was a traditional baptismal gift in wealthy families. Sets of spoons were listed in wills. A complete set might include 12 for each apostle, giving rise to the famous apostle spoons. But even humbler homes began to include spoons in their eating rituals. Wooden spoons, pewter spoons, and even bone-handled spoons became more common. These were often kept near the hearth or stored in chests, to be brought out during meals and carefully wiped afterward. In towns and among the emerging middle class, having your own spoon became a small but meaningful marker of civility. To lend someone, a spoon was a gesture of hospitality. To forget your spoon, especially while traveling, was an inconvenience. By the mid-1500s, spoons were part of dining expectations in many households. Not universal, but increasingly visible. The Tudor table, from feast to formality. The Tudor era was one of transition not only in politics and religion, but in domestic life. The table itself was changing. Earlier meals were informal. Everyone ate together, servants, family, children. But by the mid-16th century, dining began to reflect new ideas of rank and propriety. Tables were arranged by status. Seating plans mattered. Courses were timed and served with increasing coordination. And utensils, especially spoons, began to structure how people engaged with food. Formal dinners required a spoon at each place setting. Hosts might even display matching spoons to show refinement. The spoon became a QA signal that this was not a feast of fingers, but a meal with expectations. A table with spoons was a table with rules. Even the act of using a spoon required new manners. One was not to slurp. One was not to shovel. One was not to scrape the bowl loudly. Children were taught how to hold the spoon properly, not with a fist, but between fingers, guided gently to the mouth. These rules spread through schools, churches, and the writings of moralists. Guides to conduct included entire sections on spoon usage. "He who rattles his spoon in his dish is poorly bred," one noted. In this way, the spoon became not just a tool but a teacher. Silver spoons and social signals. By the later Tudor period, spoons were not only personal but symbolic. Silver, in particular, was prized. To own a silver spoon, or better yet, a set of them, was a public statement of wealth and gentility. Apprentices who completed their training might receive a silver spoon as a mark of their progress. Young brides were given spoons in dowries. Guilds gave spoons to members. Some families displayed spoons on their walls, hung like ornaments, polished and prominent. The apostle spoons, mentioned earlier, were often crafted with the likeness of a saint at the end of each handle. Collecting a full set was a spiritual and social achievement. Even Shakespeare mentions them. In Henry VIII, the character of the nurse says, "And therefore maybe you shall find my Lord of Canterbury will give him a dozen spoons." Silver spoons also served as portable wealth. In times of hardship, they could be melted or pawned. In this way, the spoon straddled the line between utility and inheritance, function and finery. The spoon and the peasant, practicality persists. For the peasantry, the spoon was less a symbol than a survival tool. A wooden spoon carved by hand might be a person's only utensil. It was used for eating, for stirring pottage, for serving gruel to children, for doling out medicine, and perhaps for scraping ashes from the hearth. Peasant spoons were not engraved, they were not displayed, but they were essential. Each household might have one or two shared among members. A child might inherit a spoon from a parent. Repairs were common. A cracked handle might be bound with leather or twine. Some spoons were whittled down over time until they became stubs. They were stored carefully, often wrapped in cloth or hung on a peg near the fire. And when lost, they were sorely missed. The peasant's spoon was a thing of use, not pride. But even here it carried quiet meaning. It was part of the rhythm of life, feeding, stirring, serving, and enduring. The fork lurks in the future. While the spoon found acceptance, the fork remained an outsider in Tudor England. Considered foreign, even effeminate, the fork was used primarily in Italy and France. English travelers who encountered forks often returned with amusement or suspicion. To eat with a fork, it was said, was to distrust the natural tools God had given you, your fingers. Spoons, by contrast, faced little of this resistance. Their use was seen as an extension of hospitality and hygiene. Their shape was familiar, their purpose obvious. But the arrival of the fork would eventually push the spoon into a more specialized role, reserved for soup, dessert, and soft foods. Still, in Tudor England, the spoon was a central character at the table, not yet overshadowed, not yet subordinate. A spoon may seem like nothing more than a curve of metal or wood, but in the England of Henry VIII, it was a signal of class, of care, of change. It taught children manners, helped travelers feel at home, and reshaped how people thought about food, civility, and the self. And so we wonder, how can something so small carry the weight of such transformation? By the mid-16th century, England's tables were in transition. Banquets became more formal, dining habits more refined, and utensils once rare increasingly found their way into daily life. Yet of all the changes in eating culture during the Tudor era, none were as quietly transformative as the widespread acceptance of the spoon. What began as a utilitarian tool became an instrument of etiquette, an heirloom, and a symbol of polite society. More than just a vessel for soup or porridge, the spoon taught people how to eat and, more importantly, how to behave while doing so. In this section, we explore how the spoon shaped not only meals but manners, class distinctions, and even religious values in Tudor England. The spoon as a moral object. In Tudor households, both noble and modest dining was no longer just about food. It was about demonstrating control, refinement, and restraint. These were the visible signs of a godly life, a concept promoted by both Protestant reformers and Catholic traditionalists. The spoon, in its quiet way, was part of that performance. To use a spoon was to show you had moved beyond the rough, greedy habits of the past, beyond the casual grabbing of food, the sloppiness of shared trenchers, the sticky-fingered handling of meat. A spoon asked you to pause, to scoop, to deliver food carefully. Writers of conduct manuals and moral instruction often use table manners as metaphors for spiritual discipline. To eat slowly, to chew modestly, to handle a spoon gracefully, these were outward signs of inner order. One writer cautioned against guzzling and gaping like a dog at broth, while another reminded diners to eat not as the oxen do, but with temperance of the hand and the tongue. The spoon became a tool of temperance, a way to show the world, and yourself, that you could control your appetite. Teaching children the spoon. Children were at the center of this shift. In noble and middle-class households, the teaching of proper spoon use became part of a child's moral and social education. Young boys and girls were instructed in how to sit, how to hold a spoon, and how not to make noise when scraping the bottom of a bowl. Clumsiness was expected, even charming in the very young, but by the age of 10 or 12, a child who could not eat politely risked social embarrassment. Hold your spoon like a quill, advised one tutor, not like a shovel. Spoon use was especially emphasized in girls' education. To be a good wife, one had to run a household, serve guests, and demonstrate gentility at all times, including meals. Girls might embroider napkins and polish spoons as part of their training. In this way, the spoon became part of how social roles were shaped, not by grand lectures, but by small, daily habits learned around the table. The spoon in religious life. Beyond the household, the spoon also appeared in religious rituals and symbolism. In Catholic Mass, for instance, the paten and chalice were often accompanied by a small liturgical spoon used to handle sacred elements. While this use declined in English practice after the Reformation, it remained common on the continent, reinforcing the association between the spoon and purity. In monastic communities, spoons were handled with care. Meals were often eaten in silence, with gestures taking the place of speech. Spoons moved rhythmically from bowl to mouth in a choreographed act of shared humility. Even outside of monasteries, prayer before and after meals included petitions for self-control and gratitude. To use a spoon gently, to eat without greed, was part of honoring the divine order, a way to separate humanity from the animals. And so, within religious and domestic spheres alike, the spoon was more than practical. It was almost sacramental. Travel and the personal spoon. By the late Tudor period, it had become increasingly common for travelers, especially those of the middling sort, to carry their own spoon. Spoons were often tucked into pouches, tied to belts, or stored with personal grooming items. A traveler without a spoon was considered unprepared, much like one without a clean shirt or proper shoes. Traveling inns rarely supplied utensils. Meals were communal, served at long tables, and the food was basic: stews, gruel, broths, or beans. Your spoon was your key to the meal. Without it, you might borrow one from the host or go hungry. Some traveling spoons were collapsible or made of tin, designed for portability. Others were simple wood, darkened with use and age. For merchants or students, the spoon was as essential as ink and coin. And it wasn't just travelers. Soldiers, sailors, and even clerks often had their own spoons, marked or carved with initials. To lose your spoon was to lose your place at the table, literally and figuratively. Spoons and social boundaries. One of the most fascinating aspects of spoon culture was how it reinforced social boundaries even within a single meal. In noble households, spoons made of silver or pewter were offered to honored guests. Servants used wooden ones. Children might receive smaller, plainer versions. The type of spoon you were given or expected to bring revealed your status. The sharing of a spoon was a complex act. Among close friends or family, it was acceptable. Between strangers, it was suspect, a risk of disease or disrespect. In this way, spoons helped shape physical and social space, controlling the flow of intimacy. This became especially important during communal events, like weddings, harvest feasts, or church dinners. One might bring a best spoon for such occasions, polished, engraved, or set with enamel. To forget your spoon was to place yourself at the mercy of others. To lend one's spoon was to offer more than convenience, it was to grant temporary belonging. The economics of spoon ownership. Though spoons were becoming more common, they were not yet cheap. A silver spoon in the 16th century could cost several shillings, the equivalent of days or even weeks of labor for a peasant. Pewter was more affordable but still a significant investment. Wooden spoons, though cheaper, required the time and skill to carve. As a result, spoons were often included in inventories and dowries. They were listed in wills alongside livestock and garments. They were stored with other valuables in boxes, chests, or cupboards. Apprentices sometimes received a spoon as a gift when they completed their term. Mothers passed spoons to daughters. Couples received matched spoons at weddings. In one 1583 London will, a man bequeaths, "To my daughter Alice, my silver spoon with the cross-engraved bowl, and the linen napkin stitched therewith, that she may remember her place at our table." Spoons were not just property, they were memory. Quiet power at the table. Ultimately, the spoon transformed the Tudor table in subtle but lasting ways. It required a person to eat more slowly. It standardized portion sizes. It reduced direct contact with shared food, encouraging cleaner habits. And it introduced without fanfare the idea that mealtime was a structured, social performance. With the spoon came new rhythms. A family might begin meals with prayer, pass dishes in a particular order, and observe a growing number of expectations. Do not clink your spoon. Do not lick it. Do not chew it. Do not drop it into the bowl. Children were corrected, servants were trained, guests were observed. And so, spoon by spoon, a nation that once ate with fingers was learning a new way not only to eat, but to live among others. From silver heirlooms to hand-carved wood, from inns to courts, the spoon carried with it a quiet revolution, one of control, civility, and community. It trained the hand, shaped the mouth, and guided the eyes. It is a tool so ordinary today that we forget it ever had to be learned. But once, long ago, in candle-lit rooms and thatched kitchens, The spoon taught England how to eat like a nation. And so we ask, what else have we learned without realizing it just by holding something in our hand? By the end of the Tudor era, the spoon had secured its place not only in kitchens and courtly halls, but in the cultural language of the English people. It had begun as a servant of necessity, carved from horn or whittled from wood. It had nestled into steaming pottage, stirred herbal tonics, and scooped the broth of the poor. But now it had become a marker of civilization itself, present at baptisms, banquets, and burials. Its journey, though largely unremarked in grand historical texts, was as real and influential as any royal decree or battlefield victory. The story of the spoon is the story of how England came to eat with dignity, to mark status silently, and to pass identity from one generation to the next, not in words, but in small, enduring gestures. A legacy of heirlooms. In the inventories of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, spoons appear with increasing frequency not only as functional items, but as prized possessions passed down through families. These weren't merely tools for eating. They were deeply personal objects, often engraved with initials, coats of arms, religious symbols, or even simple decorative flourishes. A child's christening spoon might be inscribed with a cross. A marriage spoon might bear entwined initials. A memorial spoon might carry the date of a loved one's death. Among merchants and tradesmen, a silver spoon was both a sign of arrival and a reserve of wealth, easily sold in hard times, but rarely parted with unless absolutely necessary. Pewter and brass spoons, though less valuable, were still cherished. Wooden spoons might be worn smooth by generations of use. In some households, spoons were kept in locked cabinets. In others, they were hung above hearths or stitched into the family's linen chest. A few were never used at all, set aside as keepsakes, their bowls never tasting broth. Each told a quiet story, of hands that held it, mouths it had fed, prayers it had accompanied, and tables it had known. The disappearance of the trencher. The widespread use of spoons helped hasten the disappearance of another staple of medieval dining, the bread trencher. For centuries, meals were served on thick slices of stale bread, known as trenchers. These absorbed sauces, juices, and stray bits of food. After the meal, they might be eaten by the diner or by the poor or thrown to animals. But as spoons became more common and tableware evolved, the bread trencher began to fall out of favor. In its place came wooden and then pewter dishes, individual bowls for stews, flat plates for meat. This change wasn't merely practical, it marked a turning point in how people related to food and space. The shift from shared trenchers to personal dishes, combined with spoon use, introduced the idea of personal portions, a clear boundary between yours and mine. The spoon didn't just reshape how food was eaten, it redefined who it belonged to. The spoon in ceremony and symbol. As its presence in daily life grew, the spoon also became more visible in ceremony. By the late 1500s, the giving of spoons had become formalized in many parts of England. At christenings, godparents were expected to give a silver spoon. A full set of 12 apostle spoons, one for each of Christ's disciples, was a rare and costly gift and often reserved for wealthy families. But even one or two were treasured. These spoons often had tiny figurines atop their handles: St. Peter with a key, St. Andrew with a cross, St. John with a chalice. Children might grow up learning their saints not from stained glass or sermon, but from the spoons at their table. Some families even kept ceremonial spoons for feast days, pulled out only on holidays, wiped clean, and put away again with care. In these ways, spoons crossed the boundary between utility and tradition. They were no longer just tools, but tokens of belief, memory, and social connection. Spoons in language and literature. The influence of the spoon reached even into the language of the time. Phrases like "born with a silver spoon in one's mouth" emerged during the early modern period, tying spoon ownership to privilege and fortune. To possess a silver spoon at birth was to be touched by prosperity. In plays, poems, and sermons, the spoon often appeared as a metaphor for refinement or its absence. The clattering of spoons might signal an unruly household. A missing spoon might mark a careless servant. A borrowed spoon might suggest dependency or debt. Shakespeare and his contemporaries wrote of spoons with knowing familiarity not as plot devices, but as cultural constants. The humble spoon had become so embedded in daily life that to mention it was to invoke a world. The fork arrives and the spoon endures. In the early 1600s, the fork, long resisted in England, finally began to appear on English tables, popularized by travelers returning from Italy and France. Unlike the spoon, the fork had struggled to gain acceptance. Many considered it pretentious, even heretical. Clergymen warned against it as a sign of vanity. Satirists mocked it as effeminate. But by the 17th century, the fork began to take hold, particularly among the elite. As it did, the spoon's role shifted. No longer the primary tool for all meals, it found a new home in specific courses: soups, desserts, soft puddings. And yet the spoon never disappeared. Unlike knives or forks, it retained a universality: gentle, adaptable, familiar. It belonged equally to the poor and the rich, the child and the elder, the feast and the fast. Even today, when dining customs are many and varied, the spoon remains the first utensil a child learns to use, and often the last an elder needs. Its arc, from medieval pottage to silver baptismal gifts, was never interrupted, only refined. The spoon at the end of life. Just as spoons were given at birth, they were often present at death. A bowl of broth, a final sip of wine, a soft, spoon-fed medicine. The dying were comforted with warmth brought gently to the lips, a last gesture of care. In monastic traditions, the spoon was used to deliver consecrated wine to those too weak to sip from the chalice. In humble homes, a mother might feed her father as he lay in his last days with the same spoon she once used to stir porridge as a child. The circle was quiet, the gesture was simple, and the meaning was profound. The spoon in your drawer today. And so here we are. Centuries later, the spoon remains. Stainless steel now, or plastic or ceramic, mass-produced, casually handled, often overlooked. But its story continues, hidden in plain sight. It lives in the teaspoon you stir your tea with, in the soup spoon passed to a child, in the engraved silver tucked in your grandmother's drawer. When you hold a spoon, you are holding history. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but the soft, continuous thread of human life. Nourishment, care, dignity, and ritual. 1,000 years of meals. 1,000 years of memory. Curved metal, shaped wood carried from table to table, hand to hand, life to life. Closing reflection. It is easy to think of history in terms of swords and kings, but sometimes it is shaped by quieter things. The spoon, round, reflective, unassuming, taught a nation how to eat with care, how to feed one another with grace, and how to mark the moments that matter, from cradle to grave. And so as you set yours down tonight, perhaps after a final bite or a soft sip, ask yourself this: what other small things, used every day, are quietly writing our history? Story 4. The long journey of salt, Europe's most ordinary treasure. Today it lives quietly in your kitchen, in a glass shaker or a ceramic jar, perhaps resting beside your stove. You sprinkle it on your food with little thought. A pinch here, a dash there, an everyday seasoning. But in the Europe of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, salt was not ordinary. It was power, it was wealth, it was survival, and above all, it was precious. Long before refrigeration, salt was the only reliable way to preserve food: meat, fish, cheese, even vegetables. It could make the difference between life and famine, prosperity and hunger. But its value went far beyond the table. Salt influenced the location of towns, the creation of trade routes, the building of roads, and the rise and fall of entire economies. In this section, we explore the early medieval world of salt, not the glamorous kind, but the laborious, gritty, granular story of how Europe came to depend on a simple white mineral, and the countless hands that brought it from the earth to the plate. A taste for survival. To live in medieval Europe was to understand the urgency of preservation. Fresh food spoiled quickly, especially in the summer months. Without cold storage, families had to find other ways to make meat, fish, and dairy last. Salt was the key. It dried meat. It drew moisture from fish. It allowed butter to be stored in barrels. It preserved cheese wheels through entire seasons. In monasteries and manor houses alike, salted hams and cod hung from rafters, waiting to be eaten when hunting failed or harvests ran thin. For peasants, a salted fish might be the only protein they consumed in a week. For travelers, salt-preserved foods were the only kind they could carry. For armies, salted rations meant the ability to march. Salt wasn't just a flavor, it was a necessity. And so, behind every meal, there was a hidden economy system of miners, traders, tax collectors, and laborers working to ensure that something salty found its way to the table. Sources of salt: rock, brine, and sea. Europe's salt came from three primary sources. Rock salt mined directly from the earth in places like Hallstatt in Austria, or the great salt mines of Wieliczka near Krakow in Poland. These ancient deposits, buried deep underground, formed where prehistoric seas had evaporated millions of years before. Salt springs: natural brine rising to the surface, often concentrated in valleys or marshlands. Workers would boil the brine in large pans over fire, slowly evaporating the water to leave behind salt crystals. Towns like Lüneburg in Germany and Salins-les-Bains in France became famous for this method. Sea salt harvested from coastal salt pans where seawater was trapped and allowed to evaporate in the sun. This method, common in southern Europe, was labor-intensive and required specific weather conditions. Still, it provided much of the salt used in Mediterranean trade. Each method required not only physical labor but fuel, equipment, and time. Salt did not come easily. It was the result of hard work: boiling, drying, scraping, cutting, and always carrying, for salt is heavy. And so, even in its earliest stages, salt was tied to effort. Salt towns and salt roads. Because salt was so essential, entire towns grew up around its production. Some of these towns still bear the mark of their origins in their names. Salzburg Salt Castle in Austria. Salins in France. Hallstatt from Hall, meaning salt in Austria. Salzgitter in Germany. These places didn't just produce salt, they defined regional economies. Trade routes emerged to transport salt from inland mines or coastal pans to cities, markets, and ports. These roads became known as salt roads, arteries of commerce stretching across Europe. Some salt roads crossed the Alps, others hugged the coasts. Caravans of pack animals carried sacks of salt hundreds of miles, braving snow, bandits, and taxation. Rivers were used wherever possible. Barges floated salt downstream toward lowland markets. In many cases, these roads became the basis for modern highways. Towns that grew up along salt roads prospered, and many of them still exist today, shaped by the ancient path of salt. Salt as currency. Given its value and bulk, salt was often used as a kind of currency. In Roman times, soldiers received a ration of salt known as a salarium, the origin of our word salary. In medieval Europe, certain landlords accepted rent in salt, and market exchanges were sometimes measured in how many bushels of salt a product was worth. Tolls were levied on salt carriers. Kings taxed salt producers. Salt was counted, weighed, recorded, and stored like coinage. This financial weight meant that salt was often subject to strict regulation. Guilds controlled its processing. Cities imposed trade limits. Kings declared salt monopolies, making themselves the sole legal sellers to better extract revenue. And wherever salt was regulated, there was smuggling. Illegal salt routes snaked across borders. Salt was hidden in grain sacks disguised in barrels carried under cloaks. Punishment for smuggling varied: fines, seizure of goods, even imprisonment. But the profit was worth the risk, because everyone, rich or poor, needed salt, and those who controlled it held quiet power. The labor behind the crystals. Behind every pinch of medieval salt lay hours of labor. Salt miners worked in darkness, chipping rock from underground caverns. The air was damp, the tools primitive, and collapses were not uncommon. The Wieliczka salt mine in Poland, in operation since the 13th century, stretched for miles underground. Miners spent days below the surface, sleeping near their work. Boiling brine was no easier. Workers stood over great pans, feeding fires with wood or peat, skimming the surface of the boiling water, collecting salt crystals as they formed. The heat was intense, the work repetitive, the risk of burns or respiratory illness high. In salt pans by the sea, laborers raked salt by hand under the hot sun, then shoveled it into heaps for drying. Rain could ruin days of effort. Wind could scatter the piles. Transporting salt was itself exhausting. One sack might weigh 100 pounds or more. Horses and oxen carried the bulk, but human shoulders bore their share. Salt production wasn't glamorous, but it sustained kingdoms. Salt and social status. In noble households, salt did more than preserve food, it defined the dining table. At formal feasts, a large container of salt, often ornately carved from metal, wood, or even ivory, sat at the center of the table. This was the salt cellar, and its placement mattered. Those seated above the salt, closer to the Lord and the salt cellar, were guests of honor. Those seated below the salt were of lesser rank. Thus, the very geography of the table reinforced social hierarchy. Salt was passed ceremoniously. Guests might be invited to help themselves, or a servant might dispense it carefully with a spoon or knife. To reach across the table for salt was considered impolite unless invited. In some households, personal salt dishes were used. These were rare, often reserved for royalty or high clergy. Everyone else shared. Salt was both seasoning and symbol. Salt in religion and ritual. Salt also held spiritual meaning. In Christian tradition, salt symbolized purity, preservation, and the covenant between God and man. In Catholic rites, salt was used in baptismal water and sprinkled on the tongues of infants. In some cases, salt was placed in coffins or sprinkled over graves to protect the body. Monasteries often controlled salt production in certain regions, not only for commerce, but for religious observance. Fasting foods required preservation. Monks ate salted fish, cheese, and bread, especially during Lent. In folklore, salt was also used to ward off evil. A line of salt across a threshold might keep spirits away. Spilling salt was unlucky unless you tossed a pinch over your shoulder. Salt was everywhere, in the fields, in the food, in the faith. Salt is quiet now, a condiment, a kitchen staple. But once it moved mountains, it shaped towns, it marked borders, it seasoned life itself. And so, as you drift into rest, imagine this. A caravan winding through alpine passes, sacks of salt strapped to weary horses. A miner in a dark tunnel, hammer in hand. A monk stirring a pot in a stone kitchen. A child licking her finger to taste the coarse white flakes scraped from a drying pan. Salt ordinary, invisible, keeping the world alive. But how did salt become political, and how did it help spark revolutions? Salt, though small in measure, has never been small in consequence. In the medieval and early modern world, this common mineral shaped more than diets and trade. It shaped laws, revolts, empires, and revolutions. It was counted and taxed, guarded and stolen, hoarded and smuggled, and more than once it became the quiet match that lit very loud fires. This section explores how salt so basic, so granular became deeply entangled with the politics of control. From salt monopolies to smuggling rings, royal coffers to peasant protests, we follow the grainy trail of a mineral that once helped maintain kingdoms, and eventually helped undermine them. Salt as revenue, taxing the essential. Governments quickly realized what salt producers already knew. Salt was not optional. Everyone needed it, rich and poor, soldier and priest, farmer and merchant. This made it the perfect thing to tax. In much of medieval and early modern Europe, salt was one of the most heavily regulated commodities. Monarchs and city governments levied taxes on its production, distribution, and sale. Even carrying salt across a border or river could incur a toll. These taxes became significant sources of income. France, for example, relied heavily on its salt tax known as the gabelle as early as the 14th century. The gabelle was not just a single tax but a complex system of controls, fixed prices, restricted regions, and state-controlled warehouses. Under the gabelle, different regions paid different rates. Some were exempt altogether, while others paid exorbitant prices. This created enormous resentment and enormous opportunities for smugglers. But France was not alone. Across Europe, salt revenues funded roads, wars, and royal courts. For governments struggling to manage growing populations and increasingly expensive militaries, salt became a dependable fiscal crutch. And with every increase in tax came a rise in discontent. Smuggling and the salt underground. Where there are taxes, there is evasion, and salt, due to its high demand and easy concealment, became one of the most commonly smuggled goods in Europe. Salt smuggling flourished in regions with uneven taxation where one town paid dearly for salt and the next town paid little or nothing. Carts were rigged with false bottoms. Salt was hidden in grain sacks or beneath straw. At night, smugglers crept through forests and mountain passes, evading patrols and border guards. In France, a well-developed salt smuggling network emerged. These smugglers were called faux-sauniers, false salt makers. They organized into tight-knit groups, passed down trade secrets, and developed elaborate methods for tracking patrols. Punishments were harsh. Caught smugglers could face fines, imprisonment, or forced labor in the galleys. In some areas, repeated offenses brought corporal punishment or exile. Yet still they risked it, because salt wasn't just profitable, it was necessary. When the state taxed it beyond reach, people found other means. Smuggling became not merely an economic activity, but a kind of resistance. The gabelle, France's most hated tax. Of all the salt taxes in Europe, the French gabelle was perhaps the most notorious. Imposed in its earliest form in the 14th century under King Philip VI, the gabelle evolved into a deeply unpopular institution. It was unevenly applied. Some regions were pays exempt, others pays de grand gabelle, high tax, and others still fell somewhere between. Worse still, in some regions, households were required to purchase a fixed amount of salt each year, regardless of their needs or income. This sel de devoir, salt duty, forced families to buy more salt than they could afford and often more than they could use. The result was predictable: resentment, evasion, and eventually rebellion. During the 16th and 17th centuries, revolts broke out in protest of salt taxes. The Croquant rebellions in southwestern France and the revolt of the Nupides, the Barefoot ones, in Normandy were both fueled in part by the burden of the gabelle. Even more telling, by the time of the French Revolution in 1789, abolition of the gabelle was among the loudest demands of the people. And when the revolutionaries did seize power, one of their first actions was to eliminate it. Salt in the Crown, England's approach. England, too, understood the political power of salt, though it approached taxation differently. Rather than a centralized Gabel-style system, English salt taxation developed more gradually. In the medieval period, local lords or city guilds controlled much of the salt trade, particularly in port towns and near salt springs. The crown occasionally levied duties on imported salt or imposed tolls on salt roads, but it was not until the 17th century that salt became a central object of national revenue policy. Under Charles I, salt taxes were increased to help fund his unpopular wars. Parliament, opposing these levies, used them as further evidence of royal overreach. After the Restoration, the salt tax remained growing steadily under the Stuarts and into the 18th century. The tax hit the poor hardest. Salt was used not just for seasoning but for preserving the very foods they relied on: fish, butter, and meat. And because it was taxed at multiple points, production, sale, transport, its cost was artificially inflated. Eventually, in the early 19th century, pressure mounted to repeal the salt tax. Reformers and economists argued that it stifled industry and punished the poor. By 1825, Parliament abolished the salt tax altogether to widespread relief. But for nearly 200 years, English meals were seasoned not just with salt, but with the slow burn of political frustration. Salt guilds and privilege. In cities like Venice, Lüneburg, and Lyon, salt was not simply sold, it was governed. Salt production and trade were often controlled by powerful guilds. These organizations regulated who could make salt, where it could be sold, what tools could be used, and what price it must fetch. In Venice, the Magistrato del Sale, salt office, oversaw the city's monopoly on salt production and distribution. This allowed the Venetian state to control prices and use salt profits to finance its naval empire. In Lüneburg, a Hanseatic city in northern Germany, the local salt guild held enormous sway. Salt from Lüneburg was exported across the Baltic and North Sea, and the guild's wealth funded public buildings, churches, and fortifications. Guild members, sauniers in France, Salzmeisters in Germany, enjoyed privileges, protections, and sometimes noble status. Their families formed tight circles of influence. Their decisions shaped regional economies. But their power came at a cost. As guilds monopolized salt production, they often resisted innovation, hoarded supply, and excluded outsiders. Over time, their conservatism became a drag on progress and a source of tension in rapidly changing societies. Religious salt laws. Salt had spiritual value, but it also played a role in religious law, particularly in Judaism and Islam. In Jewish dietary law, salt is essential for kashering, the process of removing blood from meat. This made salt not only a religious necessity, but a logistical challenge in times or places where access to salt was limited or expensive. In Islamic tradition, salt also held symbolic and practical significance. It was used in food preservation, cleansing rituals, and as part of traditional medicine. These religious requirements sometimes clashed with state regulations. If a government restricted salt access or raised taxes too high, it could infringe not only on economics, but on faith. This added a layer of moral and spiritual resistance to existing political discontent. In some cases, religious communities formed their own salt networks, sourcing from trusted suppliers, ensuring purity and distributing within the community. Salt then was not only political, it was also sacred. What seems mundane is often most powerful. In medieval and early modern Europe, salt was never just a flavoring. It was a substance that touched every aspect of life: economy, law, belief, and rebellion. Its regulation stirred discontent. Its scarcity bred ingenuity. Its presence fed nations. And so we are left to wonder, how could something so small, so ordinary, create consequences that shape the fate of kings? By now, you understand how deeply salt influenced the texture of everyday life in medieval and early modern Europe. It preserved food, defined social spaces, drove economies, and provoked discontent that eventually fed revolution. Yet for all its monumental influence, salt's grip on history would not last forever. In this final section, we trace the long twilight of salt's dominion. From the industrialization of production to the spread of refrigeration and the rise of global markets, salt, once the quiet force behind power and preservation, became simply ordinary. Still vital, but no longer sovereign. As you listen, you might reflect on how something so crucial could fade into routine. The world changed, but salt remained. Only its role was diminished. The industrial salt works. The decline of salt's imperial sway was not sudden. Rather, it eroded slowly over the 18th and 19th centuries as technology began to untangle salt from the web of human labor and geographic constraint. Where once salt had to be harvested by hand, scraped from pans, boiled in vast kettles over peat fires, or chipped from mine walls in suffocating darkness, the Industrial Revolution brought scale and efficiency. In Britain, vacuum pan evaporation allowed manufacturers to produce refined salt quickly and cheaply. Giant iron vats, heated by steam, processed brine at a scale medieval monks could never have imagined. This method first appeared in the late 18th century, and by the mid-19th, it was spreading across Europe and North America. Simultaneously, mechanical mining replaced picks and hand drills. Explosives, pumps, and powered hoists made it possible to extract salt from deeper and more dangerous seams. The Wieliczka salt mine, for example, began to industrialize its operations in the 1800s, replacing manual hauling with elevators and carts. And as production scaled, prices fell. What had once been reserved for the powerful or tightly rationed among the poor became accessible to nearly everyone. Salt, once locked in gilded cellars and guarded behind toll gates, began to lose its aura of exclusivity. Salt in the Age of Empire. Even as it became cheaper, salt retained one last moment in the spotlight, not in Europe, but in the colonial world. European empires, always eager for revenue, imposed salt taxes on their colonies. These were often modeled on the systems already developed back home, particularly the French gabelle and British excise schemes. In India, under British rule, the salt tax became one of the most hated forms of imperial control. The British East India Company, and later the Crown, restricted local salt production and levied duties on all salt consumption. Even coastal communities surrounded by sea were forbidden from harvesting their own salt without licenses. These policies were especially galling to the poor, who relied on salt not only for flavor but for preserving rice, fish, and vegetables. As with France, resistance simmered. And in 1930, that resistance boiled over. Gandhi's Salt March. In March 1930, Mohandas K. Gandhi, leader of India's independence movement, began a 240-mile march to the Arabian Sea. He set out from the Sabarmati ashram near Ahmedabad with a small group of followers. Along the way, others joined. His destination, the salt flats at Dandi. His purpose, to make salt illegally in defiance of British law. The Salt March was quiet. No violence, no weapons, just a protest against a rule that prevented Indians from touching the salt of their own shores. It was, in Gandhi's words, a way to strike at the root of colonial injustice, to protest not with a sword but with salt. On April 6, 1930, Gandhi waded into the sea, bent down, and picked up a handful of salt. It was a small act, but it galvanized a movement. Across India, thousands broke the salt laws. British authorities arrested over 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself. The world watched, and salt, for a brief but powerful moment, returned to its ancient role, not just as seasoning but as symbol, a symbol of control and of liberation. Refrigeration and the quiet decline. But even as salt played its final political roles, Its economic one was being slowly replaced not by new taxes or trade routes, but by technology. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, refrigeration began to transform the way humans preserved food. At first, this technology was limited to large-scale meat packers, dairy producers, and wealthy households. But by the 1920s and 1930s, electric refrigerators were making their way into middle-class kitchens. With refrigeration came a dramatic reduction in the reliance on salt for preservation. Fish could be kept fresh on ice. Meats no longer needed to be salted or smoked to survive a journey. Butter could be stored without brining. Salt remained important, still used in cheese making, pickling, and as a flavor enhancer, but its essential role in survival began to fade. And as that role faded, so too did the systems of labor, regulation, and resistance that had defined salt for centuries. A new salt world. In the 21st century, salt is everywhere and mostly unnoticed. It lies in your pantry. It seasons fast food. It's added to packaged snacks, baked goods, and breakfast cereals. It flavors soups and salad dressings. It rests quietly on restaurant tables, waiting for a hand to reach out. Salt is now produced by vast corporations with operations in multiple countries. Giant mines, such as the one in Goderich, Ontario, tunnel deep beneath the earth to harvest road salt by the ton. Seawater is processed through efficient evaporation systems to produce gourmet flake salts. Chemical companies use salt to manufacture PVC, paper, dyes, and detergents. It is still critical, just not visible. The average modern person consumes about 10 grams of salt per day. It passes over our tongues and through our arteries. It affects our health. It's regulated by nutrition labels rather than kings. Its politics today are quiet and clinical, measured in milligrams and dietary guidelines. Salt has not disappeared. It has just settled. It is no longer at the center of power. It now flows in the background of life like air or water or time. The ghosts of salt. Yet if you know where to look, the traces of salt's dominion remain. You'll find them in place names. Salzburg, Salin, Saltesh. Hallstatt, from the Celtic hal, meaning salt. You'll find them in words. Salary, from the Roman salarium. Salad, rooted in the Latin sal, salt, once made with brined vegetables. You'll find them in the architecture of old salt houses, the layout of roads that were once salt routes, the ruins of brine pans near forgotten marshes. And you'll find them in memories. In the story of Gandhi, bent over the sands. In the records of medieval guilds and smugglers. In the documents of kings who counted revenue in crystals. Salt may no longer be a battleground, but its history lingers. Final reflection. We began this story with a pinch, a small, pale mineral that seemed unremarkable, but we have followed it across time and empire. We have seen how salt shaped the kitchen, the kingdom, and the conscience. Salt was never flashy. It never wore gold or commanded armies. It moved in caravans, not crusades. It preserved fish, not thrones, but it fed history, quietly, thoroughly, persistently. And now, as you drift into quiet rest, consider the unassuming shaker beside your stove. It is not just seasoning. It is the last remnant of an empire that once ruled without ever raising its voice. Story 5. The Accounting Books of a Florentine Merchant. There are few things more profoundly boring on the surface than a 15th century ledger. Ink-stained parchment, endless rows of columns, unchanging handwriting, repetitive entries, 2 bolts of cloth, 5 barrels of olive oil, credit extended for pepper, debt paid with coin, line after line quiet as dust. Yet within the pages of these ledgers lies a mirror to a world in motion. In this story, we will descend into the paper labyrinth of Florentine bookkeeping, a place of silk, spices, debts, and double entry accounts. These were not just records of trade. They were instruments of survival, maps of empire, and monuments to trust. Behind each inked line, a relationship. Behind each balance, a risk. Florence, at the cusp of the Renaissance, was not merely a city of art and architecture. It was a city of merchants, and they kept their world running not with paint or marble, but with numbers. The merchant's desk. Picture a room not much larger than a modern study. The walls are plastered white. The window is narrow, and the shutters are open to let in the dusty Florentine air. A worn wooden desk sits beneath a crucifix. On the wall, a simple painting of the Virgin. In the corner, a chest with documents, and beside it, a scale. At the desk, a man middle-aged, bearded, in a tunic with modest embroidery. His hands are stained from ink. A thin candle has burned low. It is evening, but he writes still. A clerk, or perhaps a master merchant, recording the day's entries. On the parchment before him, in careful hand, he writes, April 12. Giovanni Battista purchases 3 lengths of linen, price 2 florins, payment deferred. Credit extended to 30 days. To us this is dull, to him this is everything. Because every line of the ledger is a memory, a risk, and a contract. If he forgets, he may not be repaid. If he miscalculates, his profit vanishes. If he loses this page, the agreement disappears. Florentine merchants did not work with emails or spreadsheets. They worked with fragile ink on expensive parchment and memory sharpened by necessity. Double-entry bookkeeping, a revolution in boredom. The true genius of Florentine bookkeeping lay in the adoption and refinement of double-entry accounting. It is almost shocking how quiet a revolution it was. Invented in its earliest forms during the 13th century and refined in Florence and Genoa in the 14th and 15th centuries, double-entry bookkeeping changed how humans thought about value. It wasn't flashy, but it was transformative. Here's the core idea. For every transaction, 2 entries are made. A debit in one account, a credit in another. If you purchase wool on credit, your inventory account increases and your debts do too. When you repay that debt, your cash decreases and so does the liability. The books must always balance. Every coin, every cloth, every delay, it all fits. 2 sides, 1 reality. It may seem obvious now, but at the time it was radical. Florentine merchants learned to track not just money in hand, but anticipated value. They could see the future in a way, predict cash flow, assess risk, compare cost versus return. The ledger became not just a record, but a tool of strategy. And at the heart of this evolution was not a nobleman or an artist or a general, but a merchant, hunched over parchment, balancing debts and goods with care. The language of the books. Florentine accounting ledgers were not written in Latin, the language of the church and law, nor were they always in fully vernacular Tuscan. Instead, they existed in a hybrid, commercial Italian, seasoned with abbreviations, numerals, and symbols. This was a merchant's language, efficient, practical, private. They used the Libro Giornale daily journal to record every transaction in chronological order. From this, they transferred information to the Libro Mastro master book, which listed accounts by name or category: wool, wine, client debts, cash on hand, etc. Other books tracked inventory, correspondence, contracts, and wages. Some merchants used cipher books, small notebooks they carried with them during travel, to record prices, currency conversions, and trade deals. The system was complex but not chaotic. It was structured with care. Each merchant developed his own symbols and abbreviations, passed down through apprenticeships and family firms. Some drew tiny diagrams. Others used marginal notes. Many listed the location of trade, such as Pisa, Naples, or Bruges, evidence that Florentine business was never local for long. Risk, credit, and the House of Medici. The lifeblood of Florentine trade was not coin, it was credit. Most transactions were not paid for immediately. Instead, buyers took goods on credit and repaid weeks or months later. Merchants extended trust and relied on memory, reputation, and enforcement to make sure debts returned. This system was efficient but dangerous. One broken promise could topple a house. To mitigate risk, merchants diversified. They spread debts across dozens of clients. They formed partnerships such as the powerful Compagnia model where risk and reward were shared. And some families took this further, becoming banks. The most famous, of course, was the House of Medici. Beginning as wool merchants, they expanded into banking, offering loans, transferring funds, and managing accounts for royalty and the papacy. Their ledgers, many of which survive, are marvels of detail. They recorded not only amounts but relationships, whether a loan was to a reliable client, whether repayment had ever been late, whether a borrower had political connections. In one entry from the early 15th century, a Medici clerk notes, Francesco of Bruges loan of 100 florins due in 60 days, has delayed twice before, secure with caution. This is not just a financial record, it's a psychological profile, a strategy, a story. Daily life in the merchant office. The rhythm of the merchant's life was shaped by routine. Morning began with correspondence. Letters arrived from other cities detailing markets, weather, prices, news. These were opened, read aloud, and answered. Next came the reviewing of accounts. Clerks reconciled journal entries, matched balances, and prepared for the arrival of customers or agents. Clients arrived in the late morning. Some paid debts, others sought new credit. Bargaining was constant but quiet. Respect was key. In the afternoon, goods were examined, quality tested, cloth measured, spices weighed, oil tasted. And in the evening, after the noise of business faded, came the ledgers, the quietest and most crucial part of the day. Only then, with concentration, could the merchant preserve the record of all that had passed. The merchant and his afterlife. Florentine merchants knew that their ledgers might outlive them. In many households, ledgers were kept not only as business tools but as family records. Fathers trained sons using old books. Wives, often deeply involved in managing the household economy, referenced them. Estates were settled using them. Some merchants even instructed that their ledgers be preserved in perpetuity, bound, sealed, and stored in chests. They saw these books not only as economic artifacts, but as proof of character, their honesty, diligence, and prudence. A good ledger was not only useful, it was moral. And so we are left with this image. A plain room, a worn desk, a man with ink-stained fingers recording in silence. It is not the stuff of legend, no battles, no palaces, no fame. But his records built cathedrals, funded voyages, hired painters, and fed cities. His careful balance of debt and credit, repeated 1,000 times over, laid the financial groundwork of the Renaissance. And it leaves us with a question. What hidden power lives in the dullest of books? The first section of our story introduced you to the ledgers of a Florentine merchant, the parchment pages on which a world of commerce, trust, and routine was quietly built. In this second section, we'll go deeper into that world. Now we follow the books beyond the desk, into the workshops, counting houses, and far-reaching trade routes that connected Florence to the rest of Europe. The Florentine merchant did not simply sell local goods to local buyers. He participated in an intricate international economy that depended on shared systems, careful measurements, and subtle signals of trust. As you listen, let your mind settle into the cadence of trade's slow ships, sealed letters, the weighing of wool, and the quiet shuffle of coin. Beneath it all lies a question. How did people build entire systems of commerce before banks as we know them? The answer, in part, is through books and through belief. The geometry of the ledger. If you were to open a ledger from the 15th century, say, the Libro Mastro of a merchant in the Arte della Lana, Wool Guild, you'd see something that resembles a city in miniature. Columns divide the page like narrow streets. Accounts stretch vertically like buildings. Each line is a window into a transaction, and each page connects to others like courtyards across alleys. There is symmetry in these ledgers, entries made with care, left and right sides balanced. It is not art, but it is not merely math either. It is structure, a geometry of trust. Each entry must correspond to another. Debit and credit, risk and reward, faith and evidence. And just as a city is held together by unseen laws, the ledger is governed by invisible rules. A sale is not complete until noted. A debt unrecorded may as well be forgotten. An unbalanced book is a threat to reputation. This structure made long-distance trade possible. A Florentine merchant, dealing with suppliers in Bruges or Constantinople, had to know that his agents abroad would follow the same principles of record-keeping, that they would measure wool the same way, use compatible currency units, and abide by the same calendar. It was not law that bound these distant actors. It was ledger logic. Everyone had to agree on the math or nothing would move. The agent abroad. A Florentine merchant rarely operated alone. He employed agents, junior partners, or trusted relatives who lived abroad in trade hubs across Europe. These agents were the merchant's eyes, ears, and hands. They bought cloth, sold spices, settled debts, and recorded everything in their own books. They sent regular letters home, enclosing excerpts from their journals, updates on market prices, and lists of goods en route. A typical letter might read: to Messer Carlo, Florence. From Venice, the 3rd of September. Silk of the fine quality from Damascus has risen 12% in cost due to delays at the port. I have acquired 10 bolts at last month's rate, thanks to Pietro's early negotiation. Sent via barge to Ferrara yesterday, expected to arrive by next Monday. Our Genoese debtor, Marco di San Giorgio, has paid 30 florins on account. Balance remains 60 florins. Shall send invoice again in 2 weeks' time. The letter is factual. It includes no flourish, no poetry. But behind each line is a human story. Storms that delayed ships, negotiations over wine, face-to-face meetings with men who might lie or delay payment. Florentine merchants relied on the honesty of these agents. A single crooked line in an agent's book could mean ruin. That is why so many agents were family cousins, brothers, nephews, bound not just by contract but by blood. The role of guilds. No merchant in Florence worked entirely alone. He was embedded in a broader institutional world, especially the guilds. The Art della Lana Wool Guild, the Art della Seda Silk Guild, and the Art del Cambio Bankers Guild were not just professional associations. They were part regulatory body, part protection agency, and part social network. These guilds enforced rules, weights and measures, allowed types of goods, accounting practices. If a merchant falsified his books or underweighed a product, the guild could fine or expel him. But guilds also offered support. They provided arbitration in disputes and maintained public books of debts and credits for those who transacted in the city. If a merchant passed away suddenly, guild officials might audit his books to ensure fair settlement of the estate. In cases of bankruptcy, the guild might supervise repayment to creditors, protecting reputations. And they held merchants to standards of moral behavior, especially regarding trust in accounting. A man whose ledgers were confusing, incomplete, or misleading might find himself cut off from trade not because of criminal charges, but because others would no longer risk doing business with him. Currencies and conversion. One of the dullest and most critical parts of the merchant's work was managing currencies. Florentine merchants traded across a patchwork of coinage systems. In Venice, the ducat. In France, the livre tournois. In England, the pound sterling. Every region had its own weights of silver and gold, and exchange rates shifted with supply, politics, and speculation. A merchant's ledger had to record all amounts in the base currency of Florence, typically the florin. a gold coin minted with the image of the city's lily seal. But before entry, the merchant had to perform conversions, often using tables of known exchange rates or estimates from agents abroad. Mistakes could be costly. A simple error in decimal placement might erase weeks of profit. Some merchants specialized in arbitrage, traveling between cities to exploit favorable exchange rates, buying silk in one place and selling it in another for a different coin, pocketing the spread. This process was boring, mathematical, and essential. A merchant could only be as successful as his ability to understand the value of money, even when it was not in his hand. When ledgers lied, not all merchants were honest, and sometimes ledgers concealed deceit. There are records of double books, one for public viewing, another for internal use. Merchants sometimes understated debts, overstated payments, or delayed recording losses in the hope of recovery. A notorious case from 1466 involved a Florentine cloth merchant, Lorenzo di Piero, who failed to record major debts to foreign suppliers. When his deception was discovered, he was forced to liquidate assets, and his name was blacklisted by the guild. But dishonesty rarely paid for long. Florentine society was small and reputation was everything. Word spread quickly. Letters were copied and shared. Rumors whispered across trade fairs. If your books were deemed untrustworthy, your business would wither. The ledger, then, was not just a record of profit. It was a record of character. A day of reckoning. Every few months, a merchant would perform a closing of the books. This was not merely a routine check. It was a day of accounting in the deepest sense. Each account was reviewed, balances confirmed, debts assessed for collectability, profits were calculated, losses admitted. The merchant might burn old cipher notes, archive closed transactions, begin a fresh volume. Some merchants recorded these closures in ceremonial language. On the feast of St. Michael, in the year 1472, I, Tommaso Ricci, have closed this book, having reconciled all accounts and settled all disputes to my knowledge. May God witness my truth. It was not just bookkeeping, it was closure, an attempt to put a moment of life in order with ink. As you rest, imagine the dusty office once again, but this time, picture it in the evening, with candlelight casting long shadows across the ledger. Outside, the bells of Florence echo through the narrow streets. Inside, the merchant runs his finger down a page of numbers, silently mouthing the sums. A faint smile crosses his lips, or maybe a frown. Tomorrow he will send a letter, or call in a debt, or forgive one. Because behind every line in the book is a decision, and behind every decision, a life. But not all debts are repaid, and not all accounts are balanced. What happens when a ledger is left unfinished? In the final section of this story, we follow the merchant beyond his desk, beyond his ledger, and even beyond his death. What becomes of a man who spent a lifetime balancing accounts, extending credit, and sealing parchment with wax? And what becomes of his books, those silent witnesses to decades of wool, coin, trust, and risk? This is the story not only of accounting, but of legacy. In a city where wealth once meant power and reputation, a ledger could be as precious as a name, a house, or a relic. Yet when the ink faded and the merchant passed, the numbers no longer moved. They became something else entirely. Let us return once more to Florence, but now with an eye on memory, inheritance, and the quiet burial of calculations. The merchant's final account. In Florence, as in much of Europe during the 15th and early 16th centuries, death was a public matter, a spiritual, legal, and economic event. For the merchant, it was also an accounting task. As life neared its end, a prudent merchant would begin to prepare what was called a libro dell'eredità, an inheritance book. This was not the same as a will, though it often served a similar function. It detailed not just possessions but debts owed, credits due, partnership shares, and even unpaid wages or unresolved legal claims. He might note, to my nephew Matteo, the share of wool held in Bruges market 18 bolts now under his supervision. Let him collect the outstanding 22 florins due from the Flemish trader Geert. To my daughter, Katerina, 1/3 of the cash reserves in the iron chest currently totaling 145 florins, to be confirmed by inventory. Let my debts to the Art della Lana and the spice agent from Lucca be settled before division. These notes were meant to guide the heirs, but also to ensure fairness, clarity, and peace. A good merchant, even in death, sought to leave no confusion behind. Accounting the body and soul. Florentine merchants, like others in Christendom, understood death as a passage not only into the earth, but into judgment. The Church taught that the soul was weighed metaphorically, and that good deeds, honesty, and charity would tip the balance. But interestingly, actual balances often played a role too. Before death, some merchants commissioned death inventories, detailed assessments of all physical property, from bolts of cloth to iron weights to wooden spoons. These were submitted to guilds, courts, or family members. Some even had a notary public record their final accounting sessions. The notary would verify the books, sign the margins, and place a wax seal, effectively closing the volume with legal authority. It was an act of final honesty. Some merchants also left gifts to the church, either in florins or in materials, wax for candles, cloth for poorhouse garments, or even interest-free loans to local parishes. These acts were not only generous but strategic, to be seen as righteous in the community and to protect one's name. In this way, the ledger was both earthly and spiritual. It measured not only coin but conscience. The merchant's chest. After death, the merchant's ledger, often placed in a wooden chest or cabinet, became a different kind of object. No longer used daily, it now became a record of memory. Heirs would consult it to track old debts, collect what was owed, or understand prior agreements. But over time, the ledger's immediate utility would fade. Still, few dared throw it away. In many Florentine homes, old ledgers were preserved for generations, kept alongside family contracts, letters, and tokens. Some were rebound in leather. Others were copied by hand onto newer parchment for easier reading. They became artifacts not of grandeur, but of diligence. Occasionally, merchants inscribed final thoughts in their books, as if speaking beyond death. I have done my work with fair measure and honest reckoning. Let my sons continue with care, and may the Lord judge the rest. Such lines remind us that for some men, the book was a kind of soul. A world on paper. By the early 1500s, Florence had become a city of record, not just art and stone, but paper and ink. From merchant firms to city tax offices, convent dowries to estate rolls, everything was increasingly written, tracked, cross-referenced. And this was no accident. As commerce grew more complex, as trade stretched from Flanders to Alexandria, and as money moved faster than ever before, memory alone was not enough. Ledgers offered continuity. A merchant might die, but his records allowed a son or partner to step into his place, carry forward the account, and keep the machine of trade turning. We can trace the shape of Florentine business across generations, simply by looking at how ledger formats evolved. Margins widened to allow commentary. Dates were standardized to match church calendars. Symbols for florins, ducats, and livres became uniform. Clerks used ink colors to highlight unusual entries or losses. One family's accounting system might be adopted by another. Certain formats became citywide norms. Eventually, these methods would influence systems across Europe from Antwerp to London. And yet, the bones of the system remained rooted in those early Florentine books, scribbled by men in modest rooms, watching their candles burn low. The ledgers rediscovered. Centuries later, long after the merchants were dust, their books remained. In attics, in family archives, in church libraries, in city hall vaults. And beginning in the 19th and 20th centuries, historians unearthed them to the great indifference of the public. There was no drama, no wars, no romantic secrets. Only names, dates, transactions, wool, spices, shipments, loans, salt, credit, numbers. Yet those historians discovered something profound. Within these records lay the infrastructure of the Renaissance. These dusty ledgers revealed the scale of global trade, the interconnectedness of city-states, the dependence of artists, princes, and popes on merchants, and the sheer intellectual sophistication of bookkeeping before calculators, computers, or banks. The ledgers spoke to a world of patience, a world that moved slowly, deliberately, built not on bursts of brilliance but on routine, repetition, and recording. From Florence to the world. The principles first refined in Florence double-entry accounting, credit ledgers, risk balancing spread slowly but irrevocably. Venetian merchants adopted them. Genoese bankers refined them. The Fugger banking house in Germany used them to finance emperors. By the 17th century, they were standard across Europe. Eventually, they became the foundation of modern accounting, taught in universities, applied in corporations, and used to balance national budgets. And yet, at the root of it all lies a merchant's book 15 inches high, bound in goatskin, filled with iron gall ink. A book opened daily by a man with tired hands, watching markets and listening to footsteps at the door. This is how systems are born, not in thunder but in the scratch of pen on paper. Final reflection, a monument of numbers. So what becomes of a ledger? It is not read like a poem. It is not admired like a painting. It is not wept over like a letter. But it endures. Because within the pages of a Florentine merchant's ledger, we find something profound, not the life of one man, but the quiet pulse of a system, a city, an age. The ledger asks for nothing, expects no applause, and tells no story unless you know how to look. And in that silence, it whispers the ultimate truth of history, that the most enduring legacies are often the dullest ones. Story 6. Medieval laundry soap, ash, and endless scrubbing. You live in a world saturated by hygiene. Water runs at the turn of a tap. Soap is scented, foaming, antiseptic. Machines hum behind closed doors, washing clothes clean in less than an hour, spinning them into readiness. Detergents carry names of brightness: Tide, Dawn, Breeze. But centuries ago, before detergent, plumbing, and spin cycles, there was ash, there was lye, there was boiled urine, and there was work. In this story, we return to one of the most unglamorous but essential activities of daily life, laundry in medieval Europe. And we do not mean in palaces or castles, but in cottages, backyards, public washhouses, and slow-moving rivers. This is not a tale of revolutions, battles, or kings. It is the tale of soaking, wringing, sun-drying, and repetition. It is the story of buckets, basins, and backs bent over stone. Here, boredom reigns supreme, and yet in that boredom lies the rhythm of life. What was laundry in the Middle Ages? In medieval Europe, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, laundry was not a daily chore. It was a major event, done irregularly, often communally, and always laboriously. Clothes were not washed after every wear. In fact, outer garments like tunics or cloaks were rarely washed at all. Underclothes, linens worn close to the skin, were the main focus of washing. For the average peasant family, laundry day happened every few weeks, sometimes less frequently in winter. For noble households, it might happen more often, with dedicated servants or laundresses performing the task. Regardless of social class, laundry was slow, physical, and dirty work. And it began not with water but with a decision: was the effort worth it? The laundry tools: ash, urine, and sunlight. Forget modern soap. The most common historical laundry agent in medieval Europe was lye, made by mixing wood ash with water. When water is poured through hardwood ash, a caustic alkaline liquid forms potassium hydroxide. This substance breaks down oils and grease. It is dangerous to skin and eyes and hard on cloth, but it works. Another common additive was urine, specifically stale urine, rich in ammonia. Ammonia helps loosen dirt and acts as a primitive bleach. Fulling mills used it to clean wool, and laundresses sometimes used it to lift stains. We must pause here and consider what this means. In order to wash garments, a woman or servant might collect urine in pots over several days, storing it until it fermented. This was not scandalous. It was practical. The smell unpleasant, of course, but life was full of smells. So the standard washing process often went like this. Soak clothes in cold water to loosen dirt. Rub them with lye urine, or a mixed scrubbing by hand or on rough stones. Rinse repeatedly in clean water, not always available. Wring by hand. Hang or lay garments out to dry, ideally in the sunlight, which bleached whites and reduced odors. There were no metal wash tubs for most people. Washing was done in wooden barrels, stone basins, or directly in rivers. The labor behind the lather. Who did the laundry? The answer almost always is women. Whether in a peasant household or a noble manor, laundry fell into the domain of women's work. Wives, daughters, maidservants, and professional laundresses bore the burden. And it was heavy. A single load of soaked linen could weigh tens of pounds. Lifting, wringing, and hauling wet fabric was physically exhausting. Historical records and paintings show women working in groups by rivers, near wells, or in back courtyards. Some beat the garments with wooden paddles called battledores, or used washing stones, flat rocks on which cloth was scrubbed and slapped. In wealthier homes, laundry was done in dedicated washrooms or courtyards. Water was heated over fires, carried in buckets, and poured by hand. Sometimes the process took days. Public washhouses and riverbank society. By the later medieval period, especially in towns, public washhouses emerged. These were simple structures near rivers or springs, with basins for soaking, benches for scrubbing, and roofs to shield from sun or rain. Some were municipal, others were privately run. In France they were called lavoirs, in Italy lavatory, in England just washhouses. For many women, these places served as both chore site and social space. Gossip flowed as freely as water. Local news, family troubles, births, and betrayals were all aired alongside the linens. But not everything was communal. In some cities, rules governed when different classes or groups could use the facilities. Sumptuary laws even regulated who could hang laundry where, lest noble linens be seen drying next to peasants' tunics. At the riverbank, hierarchy and hygiene intertwined. Weather and the waiting game. Laundry depended on weather. If rain fell after a long day of scrubbing, clothes could not be dried. Worse, they might mold. Winter washing was rare both because of freezing temperatures and because water sources were sometimes inaccessible. Thus, people planned washing days carefully. Letters from noble estates record discussions like, "Shall we wash the small linens on St. Lucy's Day, if the sun permits? Otherwise, wait until Epiphany." In colder months, garments were sometimes air-dried indoors, near hearths which made them smell smoky, but at least dried them slowly. Even in good weather, drying took hours. Lines were strung between trees or posts. Some garments were laid on hedges, walls, or the grass, all depending on the space available. Bird droppings, mud splashes, or dogs could ruin the work, so vigilance was required even after the scrubbing was done. How clean was clean? This is the question modern readers often ask. Were medieval clothes ever really clean? The answer depends on what we mean by clean. In the medieval mindset, Visible whiteness was the main goal, especially for linen. Clean clothes did not mean sterilized or perfumed garments, but textiles free of visible grime, with a fresh smell from air and sun. The idea of germ theory didn't exist, nor did our modern obsession with daily washing. Instead, people sought a respectable level of cleanliness, tied to honor, health, and godliness, but within the limits of the age. Some clues from the period. Priests and monks were required to wear clean linen for Mass. Women's dowries often included linens explicitly described as washed. Bathhouses and laundry services were often linked, indicating a shared sense of ritual cleanliness. So yes, they were clean by their own standards, and that mattered. As the day ends, imagine a small river outside a village. You hear the slap of wet cloth against stone. Laughter rises between women. One adjusts a headscarf. Another wrings a tunic until her arms ache. They do not speak of revolutions, wars, or kings. They speak of children, of weather, of debts and hopes. And they keep scrubbing. Because in a world of mud, ash, smoke, and wool, clean clothes meant dignity. But what happened when laundry crossed from household to commerce, when washing became a profession, and laundresses walked a careful line between trust and suspicion? In the first section of this story, we examined the basic techniques, materials, and burdens of medieval laundry, a humble, grueling, and necessary part of everyday life. Now, in this second chapter, we shift focus from the household to the workplace, from domestic drudgery to professional labor. For while every family laundered in some way, there also existed a special class of workers who washed for others, the professional laundresses. They were trusted, they were feared, they were essential, and yet they walked a strange line in society, both necessary and suspect, both intimate and invisible. Here, we step into the soaked skirts and cracked hands of the medieval laundress. Her story is one of skill, reputation, and proximity to both filth and privilege. The rise of the laundress. By the late medieval period, particularly from the 13th century onward, cities across Europe became more urbanized and socially stratified. As towns grew and labor became more specialized, an emerging class of urban service workers developed. Among them were professional laundresses. These were women, almost exclusively women, who took on the washing duties of wealthier households, clerical institutions, guild halls, and even military garrisons. They were known by different names across regions. In France, lavandière. In Italy, lavandea. In England, simply laundress. They did not have shops. Instead, they worked from home or collected laundry from patrons, did the washing in rivers or public washhouses, and returned the clean garments days later. To wash another person's clothes was a service laden with trust, especially when handling intimate linens or expensive fabrics. But it was also a position of low status, vulnerable to suspicion, overwork, and poverty. And yet many did it because washing paid. Tools of a professional trade. Unlike household washers who scraped by with ash and urine, professional laundresses developed techniques to handle finer garments and higher expectations. Their toolkit often included soap, when affordable, especially in urban areas. This could be made from animal fat and lye, or imported from places like Castile or Marseille. Fuller's earth, a clay-like substance used to remove oil and grease from woolens. Wooden paddles or beetles used to beat dirt from fabric. Strong cords or pegs to hang and secure valuable garments. Whitening agents such as chalk or powdered lime to brighten linens. Laundresses needed to know which fabrics could be boiled, which required soaking, and which might shrink or bleed. They also had to manage logistics, collecting, tracking, and returning clothing for multiple clients, often without written records. Mistakes meant loss of income or worse, accusations. A matter of reputation. Because laundresses handled items worn closest to the body undergarments, nightshirts, kerchiefs, their role was oddly intimate. And in medieval society, intimacy and morality were deeply entwined. As a result, laundresses were frequently associated with immorality, not always fairly, but the stereotype stuck. They were seen as gossips because of the stories they might overhear or the letters they might read while folding garments. They were assumed to be loose women, simply because they worked outside the home or near men's quarters. They were accused of theft, especially if expensive items went missing. Some cities tried to regulate the profession. In 15th century Paris, laundresses were subject to sumptuary laws limiting their dress. They were forbidden from wearing veils or luxury fabrics, so as not to be mistaken for gentlewomen. Guilds sometimes excluded them, arguing that their work was unskilled. But laundresses formed informal associations, loose networks of reputation and recommendation, where a good name was more valuable than a certificate. Even in monastic settings, laundresses were hired cautiously. Some monasteries built separate quarters or created gates so that laywomen could deliver clean laundry without entering the cloister. The work was intimate, the trust was fragile. Men's laundry, women's hands. In the military camps of France and England during the Hundred Years' War, 1337–1453, laundresses played an essential if unglamorous role. Known as washerwomen of the army, these women followed soldiers, often unofficially, and performed critical support work, washing bloodied tunics, lice-infested linens, and mud-caked socks. Officially, only a limited number were permitted per unit. Unofficially, many more followed. Their work reduced disease, improved morale, and offered soldiers a taste of domestic life amid violence. They were sometimes allowed to ride in wagons, sometimes paid in food or coin. At other times, they were subject to harassment, scapegoating, or abuse. In royal courts and noble households, laundresses had similarly complicated positions. They washed the linens of kings and queens but were treated as invisible labor, often denied names in the records. And yet the fabrics they handled were far from humble. Think cambric ruffs worth a month's wages, silken hose imported from Italy, embroidered nightgowns with gold thread. Imagine the fear of ruining such a garment, or the care needed to wash it without damage. These women washed history itself and left no mark of their own. Payment and poverty. What did a laundress earn? Historical records vary, but a general estimate in 14th century France might be 2–4 deniers per bundle or per garment, depending on size and condition. In England, a laundress might earn a few pence per day. This was not enough to live comfortably, especially in cities. Many laundresses worked part-time, combining their duties with spinning, child-rearing, or brewing. Others worked in wealthy households, receiving food and shelter in exchange for labor. But they remained precarious. They could lose work in bad weather, fall sick and be replaced, be falsely accused and cast out, or simply age out of the job. For washing was a young woman's task, and the body could only carry so many buckets before breaking down. Some women passed their clients to daughters. Others faded quietly into obscurity, their names forgotten even as their labor lingered on the fabric. The political power of laundry. Despite their marginality, laundresses occasionally wielded collective power. In 16th century Lyon, France, when washhouse fees were raised, a group of laundresses protested, threatening to abandon their post unless prices were fair. In other towns, women petitioned for dedicated wash areas or for protection from harassment. Though rarely recorded as citizens with formal rights, laundresses still moved through public space. They had access to news, gossip, and information. In some cases, they knew secrets overheard in bedrooms or read on discarded letters. Writers of the period occasionally portrayed laundresses as wily, sharp-tongued, or even politically aware. And while these depictions were often exaggerated, they reflect a reality. Laundresses had eyes and ears in places others did not. They washed the garments of merchants, priests, knights, and widows, and in doing so, became unseen archivists of the social fabric. Clean but never clean enough. No matter how hard they worked, laundresses rarely escaped judgment. If they were too quiet, they were hiding something. If they spoke too much, they were gossips. If they washed too slowly, they were lazy. If they washed too fast, they were careless. They worked near water, but could not wash off society's suspicions. Even their proximity to soap, a symbol of purification, could not cleanse the stigma of their role, because in the eyes of many, to clean filth was to be of it. And yet they persisted, not because the work was noble, but because it was necessary. Because clothes get dirty, because someone must clean them, and because in the endless cycle of wash and wear, the laundress is the quiet force that restores the world to order, one wet sheet at a time. The laundress folds the final shift. She places it gently into a basket lined with straw. She ties a cloth around her head, wipes her hands on her apron, and steps into the street. The clean linen will be worn by someone else, her labor unseen. And yet without her nothing is ready, nothing is fit, nothing is respectable. Still, a question lingers. What happens when machines arrive? When soap is no longer made by hand and laundry becomes industrial? Will the laundress disappear, or merely change her name? The laundress vanishes into the damp streets of the early modern city, her basket of clean linen carried on a bent back. She does not know that her profession, one of the oldest, most humble, most laborious, is about to change. But not quickly. Before the hum of machinery, before soap was boxed and perfumed, before laundry became something that happened quietly behind the white door of a suburban home, there was a long, drawn-out transition stretching from the 16th to the 19th centuries, where hand, heat, and habit met the slow gears of industrial transformation. This final section explores that shift, from ash and riverbank to boiler and box mangle, from women's labor to steam-powered efficiency. And even though we're still focused on the mundane laundry, we begin to see how even the dullest task is touched by revolutions in science, gender, and power. Soap, from cauldron to commerce. Let us begin with soap, the heart of cleanliness. In the medieval world, soap was handmade in small batches, often with local animal fats and ashes. It was coarse, gray, and caustic, a tool, not a luxury. By the 17th century, however, commercial soap making began to emerge, particularly in port cities like Marseille, Naples, and Bristol. What changed? Trade. With expanded access to olive oil, alkaline salts, and herbs, cities with naval connections could import ingredients, refine processes, and sell the finished product. In France, Louis XIV even established regulations for Marseille soap makers requiring that only olive oil be used, setting purity standards and protecting trade guilds. Soon, soap became an industry, not necessarily a widespread luxury, but available enough to change the nature of laundry. Middle-class homes in the 18th century, especially in England, might keep bars of soap wrapped in cloth, stored away from moisture, and used judiciously on fine linens. Perfumed soaps followed. By the 19th century, advertisements for fragrant washing cakes filled city newspapers. Still expensive for the poor, yes, but symbolically important. Soap now meant more than just cleanliness. It meant modernity. It meant respectability. It meant class. And with it came new standards. Whites had to be whiter, shirts stiffer, children cleaner. Laundry's burden grew heavier, even as the tools improved. The laundry room becomes a machine. The next great shift arrived not in the wash basin, but in the boiler room. The Industrial Revolution transformed every corner of labor, and washing was no exception. From the mid-18th century to the mid-19th, a range of innovations began to mechanize the laundry process. These included 1. The copper boiler. Large, permanent kettles heated over coal fires, used to boil water for soaking clothes, a fixture in middle-class Victorian homes. 2. The washing dolly. A wooden plunger with legs, used to agitate clothes in a tub. This tool, also called a passer or peggy, allowed deeper penetration of soap and water, imitating the hand scrubbing of the laundress. 3. The box mangle. A large contraption with weighted rollers, used to press water from heavy fabrics. Expensive and cumbersome, it was mostly found in communal washhouses or the homes of the wealthy. 4. The wringer mangle. 2 rollers operated by a hand crank. Still common today in some forms, the wringer dramatically reduced drying time and strain on the washer's arms. Each invention saved time, but each also introduced new social expectations. Now that mechanical help existed, more washing was expected. Cleanliness became a moral ideal, especially for women. The Victorian ideal of the angel in the house included the angel of the laundry room tirelessly keeping her children white-dressed and her husband's shirts crisply starched. Technology did not reduce laundry's social pressure, it multiplied it. The rise of the washhouse. For the working poor, these machines were often out of reach, but new forms of shared space helped. By the early 19th century, public washhouses reappeared across industrial cities, but this time, not as riverbank shacks. These were government or philanthropist-funded hygiene institutions designed to improve sanitation and provide services to the poor. The first modern example opened in Liverpool in 1842, led by Kitty Wilkinson, an Irish immigrant who gained recognition for allowing her neighbors to use her boiler during a cholera outbreak. Her advocacy helped spark the Public Baths and Washhouses Act of 1846 in Britain. These washhouses were organized spaces. Long rows of copper boilers, cold and hot taps, slate washing slabs, drying rooms with heated air. Some included childcare or reading rooms, a nod to the length of time required. Women queued with baskets, bringing their linens on designated days. Tokens were sometimes required, fights broke out, friendships were made. And the laundress, once alone by the river, now washed under supervision among dozens, in a room echoing with steam, talk, and the clatter of wet fabric. The silent revolution, laundry becomes a private act. By the late 19th century, the final transformation begins. Laundry becomes domestic again, but with different tools, different meanings, and different identities. With mass production, wringers, tubs, and eventually rotary washers enter the home. Soap becomes a commercial product, sold in wrappers, boxes, and tins. Starch, bleach, and bluing powder all become household staples. Women are taught through manuals, magazines, and advice columns how to maintain spotless homes. Cleanliness is no longer just about health or visibility. It's about moral standing. In America and parts of Europe, Monday is wash day becomes the household refrain. The process is still long, sometimes 8 to 10 hours of work, but it is considered essential. Even as housewives gain machinery, they are still expected to wash by hand in many cases, especially for delicate or fine garments. And for lower-income families, the task remains fundamentally the same: bend, soak, scrub, wring. But now it is done in private, behind the curtain of domestic virtue. The laundress has disappeared, or has she? Ghosts of the laundress. Though the professional laundress declined in the West by the early 20th century, her legacy lingered. In literature, she became a symbol sometimes of poverty, sometimes of resilience, often both. Writers from Émile Zola to George Gissing portrayed washerwomen as the tired undercurrent of urban life, always there, always working, always wet. In visual art, the laundress stood for working-class femininity, her arms strong, her face flushed. Degas painted her. Toulouse-Lautrec sketched her. Even Picasso, early in his career, rendered laundresses in charcoal. They were not romanticized. They were respected or at least observed. And beyond art, their labor echoed in immigrant communities well into the 20th century. Chinese immigrants in America, for example, became launders of clothes out of necessity and exclusion, opening thousands of small wash houses in cities and towns. Laundry, once women's work, now became survival work, regardless of gender. Today, automated washers do most of the labor, but in many parts of the world, hand washing remains the norm. Rivers still host garments, sun still bleaches linen, and ash still bubbles in water. The story is not over. Final thoughts: what laundry teaches history. So what can the humble act of laundry teach us about history? Quite a lot. Laundry reveals technological change in the form of tools and soaps, gender roles through expectations and labor, social class through who washed and who paid, urban development via washhouses and shared spaces, commerce in the rise of soap and detergent, colonialism as clothes and cleanliness standards spread, resistance in the protests and adaptations of washerwomen. It also teaches us something quieter, the continuity of care. For thousands of years, someone has washed what others wore, often with no thanks, no name, and no reprieve. And today, as you drop a shirt into the drum of a humming machine, you stand in the final link of that long chain. The laundress may be gone, but her work in the rhythm of water, soap, and labor lives on.